The cold December wind cut through my coat as I stood on my parents' doorstep, Tommy's small hand warm in mine. My 7-year-old son clutched the gift he'd spent weeks making for his grandmother, glitter still stuck under his fingernails from the careful decoration. When my father opened the door, his face wasn't welcoming. "Tommy can't come in," he said flatly, blocking our entry. Through the frosted window behind him, I glimpsed my sister Lauren's 3 children already inside, tearing into presents by the twinkling tree. My mother appeared, her eyes avoiding mine entirely. The shocking rejection of my innocent child who just wanted to give Grandma her present made something click in my mind. This wasn't about Tommy at all. "What do you mean he can't come in?" My voice shook as I stood there, still processing the words my father had just spoken. The porch light flickered above us, casting strange shadows across David's stern face. "He's too disruptive, Sherry. We've talked about this." My father's tone held a finality that made my stomach drop. "Talked about what? When did we talk about anything?" I pulled Tommy closer, feeling him shrink against my leg. My mother Nancy stepped forward slightly, still not meeting my eyes. "At Thanksgiving, dear, when he knocked over my antique vase. Lauren mentioned her children were upset by the incident." "Upset? It was an accident. He was playing with Madison and bumped the table." The memory rushed back. Tommy had been playing tag with his cousin when his elbow caught the edge of the tablecloth. The vase had wobbled and fallen, shattering on the hardwood floor. He'd immediately burst into tears, apologizing over and over. "It's more than just that," David continued, his hands gripping the doorframe as if guarding the entrance to a fortress. "Lauren says he's been too rough with her girls. They're afraid of him." "Afraid Tommy has never hurt anyone in his life." My voice rose, and I felt Tommy's grip tighten on my coat. "Mommy, why doesn't Grandpa want me to come in?" His small voice broke through our adult tension, and I saw my mother flinch. "Your behavior has consequences, young man," David said directly to Tommy, who buried his face in my side. "Don't you dare speak to my son that way." Anger replaced my shock. "He's 7 years old, and you're treating him like a criminal." Nancy wrung her hands, glancing nervously at David. "Perhaps if you got him some help, dear. Lauren mentioned there are wonderful therapists who work with energetic children." "Energetic? You mean normal?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Every child runs and plays. Every child has accidents. "Not like Tommy," David said firmly. "He's different. More difficult." The word difficult hung in the air between us. Inside the house, I heard Lauren's children laughing, the sound of wrapping paper, tearing my sister's voice, calling them to look at another present. The contrast made my heart ache. "So, let me understand this," I said, slowly trying to control my shaking voice. "My son accidentally broke a vase 6 weeks ago, and now he's banned from Christmas, while Lauren's kids are inside opening presents." "It's not just the vase," Nancy said too quickly. "There have been other incidents." "Name one." They exchanged a look that made my skin crawl. It was rehearsed, practiced, like they'd prepared for this conversation. "He's too loud during dinner," David offered. "He asks too many questions during family gatherings," Nancy added. "He runs in the house. He doesn't sit still during movies." Each accusation felt more ridiculous than the last. They were describing every 7-year-old boy in America, not some problem child, but the way they delivered these complaints with such seriousness, such conviction. It was as if they'd been building a case. "I want to talk to Lauren," I said suddenly. "No." David's response was too sharp, too immediate. "That's not necessary. This is between us." "Between us? She's the one claiming her children are afraid of my son. I have a right to hear it from her directly." Nancy grabbed David's arm. "Maybe we should all calm down. It's Christmas Eve." "Yes, it is," I said bitterly. "And you're turning away your grandson on Christmas Eve. How calm should I be about that?" Through the window, I saw Lauren walk past a glass of wine in her hand. She glanced toward the door, but quickly looked away when she saw me. That deliberate avoidance told me everything I needed to know. "She's been talking to you about Tommy, hasn't she?" having little meetings, little conversations about my son. The pieces were starting to come together in my mind. How many times? How many phone calls? Neither of them answered, but Nancy's guilty expression confirmed my suspicions. We're only thinking of what's best for everyone, David said, his tone patronizing. Sometimes difficult decisions have to be made. Difficult decisions? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. You mean choosing Lauren's kids over mine? That's not difficult. That's cruel. Tommy tugged on my hand. Mommy, I made this for Grandma. He held up the picture frame he'd decorated, covered in painted macaroni and glitter with a photo of him and Nancy from last summer at the beach. Nancy's face crumbled for just a moment before David stepped in front of her. Take him home, Sherry. This isn't the time or place. When is the time? When is the place? I demanded. When were you planning to tell me my son wasn't welcome in your home anymore? We thought you'd understand, Nancy whispered. We thought you'd see that he needs help. The only thing he needs is grandparents who love him unconditionally. I scooped Tommy up his legs, wrapping around my waist, the picture frame pressed between us. But apparently, that's too much to ask. As I turned to leave, David called after me. You're being dramatic, Sherry. Think about what's best for Tommy. I spun around, my son's weight heavy in my arms, but my resolve heavier. I am thinking about him every second of every day, which is more than I can say for you. The door closed before I could say anything else. The click of the lock loud in the quiet night. Through the window, the warm glow of Christmas lights and family celebration continued without us. Lauren's children were laughing, my parents were smiling, and the tree sparkled with ornaments Tommy and I had helped hang just 3 weeks ago. Why don't Grandma and Grandpa want me? Tommy asked as I carried him to the car, his voice small and confused. I buckled him into his car seat, my hands trembling with rage and hurt. I don't know, baby, but it's not your fault. You haven't done anything wrong. Did I break Grandma's vase too bad? No, sweetheart. Sometimes adults make mistakes, big ones, and this is Grandma and Grandpa's mistake, not yours. As I drove away from my childhood home, Tommy's decorated picture frame on the seat beside me, I knew something fundamental had just shattered. And unlike my mother's vase, it couldn't be swept up and thrown away. My parents had chosen a side believed lies about my innocent child and shut us out on Christmas Eve. But why? What could Lauren possibly gain from turning our parents against a 7-year-old boy? The question burned in my mind as I drove through the dark streets, my son's quiet, sniffles the only sound in the car. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. 3 days after Christmas, I stood on Lauren's doorstep at 8 in the morning. I dropped Tommy off at my friend Sarah's house, not wanting him to witness what was about to happen. The holiday decorations on Lauren's perfect suburban home seemed to mock me. The wreath on the door proclaimed joy while I felt anything but joyful. Lauren opened the door in her silk pajamas, coffee mug in hand. Her face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Surprise, guilt, then a forced smile. Sherry, what are you doing here so early? She didn't invite me in. We need to talk about Christmas Eve. I pushed past her into the foyer. About what you told Mom and Dad about Tommy. I don't know what you mean. She closed the door slowly, taking a sip of her coffee to buy time. Don't play dumb with me, Lauren. They said you told them your kids are afraid of Tommy, that he's too rough with them. She set her mug down on the hallway table, crossing her arms. Well, aren't they entitled to feel safe? Whoa, safe from a 7-year-old boy who worships his cousins? I couldn't keep the incredulity out of my voice. Madison literally asked Tommy to be her show-and-tell subject last month because he taught her to ride a bike. Things change, Lauren said coolly. Children can be unpredictable. Cut the crap. What did you tell them? She walked past me into her pristine living room, forcing me to follow. Everything in Lauren's house was magazine perfect. White furniture, glass tables, not a toy or crayon in sight, despite having 3 children. I expressed some concerns, she said, finally settling onto her couch. As a mother, I have to protect my children. From what? What has Tommy ever done to your kids? Lauren picked at an invisible piece of lint on her pajamas. He's hyperactive, Sherry. You have to admit that. He's a normal 7-year-old boy. Is he, though? She looked up at me with fake concern. When was the last time you had him evaluated? There are so many resources available now for children with behavioral issues. Behavioral issues? I felt my hands clench into fists. You mean playing tag, laughing too loud, being excited about dinosaurs? I mean the inability to sit still, the constant need for attention, the disruptive behavior. She counted off on her manicured fingers. These are classic signs. Signs of childhood. I wanted to shake her. Your Madison cartwheels through the grocery store. Should I be concerned about her? That's different. How is it different? Lauren stood up, smoothing down her pajamas. I don't expect you to understand. You've always been defensive about Tommy. Because there's nothing wrong with him. Denial doesn't help anyone, least of all Tommy. Her voice took on a patronizing tone that made my skin crawl. Getting him help isn't admitting failure as a mother. I cannot believe you're doing this. I sank into one of her spotless white chairs. We're sisters. Tommy loves you. He made you a bracelet for Christmas that he didn't even get to give you. Something flickered across her face. Guilt, maybe. But it was gone in an instant. About that, she said, returning to her controlled tone. I've been meeting with Mom and Dad about this situation. Meeting how many times? A few? She waved her hand dismissively. We're all just concerned about family dynamics. Family dynamics? You mean excluding my son? I stood up, energy coursing through me. When was the first meeting? I don't remember exactly. Try. She sighed dramatically. Maybe 2 months ago after the Halloween party. What happened at the Halloween party? I racked my brain trying to remember any incident. Tommy got very excited about his costume prize. He was jumping around screaming. It overwhelmed Sophia. He won best costume. He was happy. The memory came flooding back. Tommy in his homemade robot costume, complete with cardboard boxes, spray-painted silver, and LED lights I'd helped him attach. He'd been so proud when they called his name. Exactly my point. He can't regulate his emotions. He's 7. My girls don't act like that. Your girls are afraid of butterflies, Lauren. Should we have them evaluated for excessive anxiety? Her face flushed. Don't turn this around on my children. Why not you're pathologizing normal behavior in mine? I stepped closer to her. What else have you been telling them? What other meetings have I missed? There was one last month. She admitted, chin raised defiantly. Mom called it. She wanted to discuss Thanksgiving plans and how to manage things. Manage Tommy, you mean? If you want to put it that way. A family meeting about my son that I wasn't invited to. The betrayal cut deep. What did you discuss exactly? Lauren walked to her kitchen and I followed. Everything was white marble and stainless steel, pristine and cold. She poured herself more coffee, not offering me any. We talked about strategies, ways to help Tommy integrate better with the family. By banning him from Christmas. That wasn't my idea, she said quickly, too quickly. Whose was it then? Dad thought maybe some space would be good, to reassess. Reassess what? He's a grandchild, not a business merger. I watched her avoid my eyes. What aren't you telling me, Lauren? Nothing. I'm just trying to look out for everyone's best interests. Everyone's or just yours? She set her mug down hard. What's that supposed to mean? I don't know. You tell me. Why are you so invested in painting my son as a problem child? I'm not painting anything. I'm observing and reporting. To who? Mom and Dad? Who else? A thought struck me. Have you been documenting things? Taking notes. Lauren's pause was too long. I may have kept some records for reference. Show me. I don't think... Show me what you've been writing about my son. She left the kitchen, returning with a folder from her home office. She handed it to me reluctantly. Inside were pages of handwritten notes dating back 6 months. Each entry detailed interactions with Tommy, but twisted to sound concerning. Tommy unable to sit through Sophia's dance recital. One read, the truth. It was 3 hours long, and even I struggled to stay awake. Tommy insisted on showing everyone his rock collection during dinner. Normal, he'd found some interesting rocks at the park and was excited to share. Tommy interrupted adult conversation multiple times. He's 7. He had questions about why the sky is blue. Page after page of normal childhood behavior, documented like evidence in a court case. My hands shook as I read. "You've been building a case against him," I whispered. "For 6 months, you've been collecting evidence to make my son look bad." "I've been keeping track of concerning patterns," she corrected. "Why?" I looked up at her, searching her face for my sister, for the person who used to braid my hair and share secrets. What could you possibly gain from this? It's not about gaining anything. It's about the well-being of the family. Tommy is family. Of course he is. That's why we want to help him. By convincing our parents he's disturbed, by getting him banned from holidays. I threw the folder on her counter papers, scattering, "This is sick, Lauren." "You're overreacting, as usual." "As usual? What else have you been telling them about me?" She turned away, busying herself with wiping down her already clean counter. "Just that you tend to be defensive. That you might not be seeing things clearly. So you're not just attacking my son, you're undermining me as a mother too." "I never said you were a bad mother. Just a blind one who can't see her son's obvious problems." I laughed bitterly. "Tell me, Lauren, in all your documentation, did you note the time Tommy spent 2 hours helping Madison with her math homework? Or when he gave Sophia his favorite toy because she was sad about losing hers? Individual acts don't negate patterns of behavior." What patterns? Being a child. Being enthusiastic about life. I gathered up the scattered papers, shoving them back in the folder. "I'm keeping these. Evidence of your obsession." "That's my property." Sue me." I headed for the door, then turned back. "One more thing. Mom mentioned you've been calling them a lot. More than usual. What else have you been discussing?" Lauren's perfectly composed face showed a crack of something. Nervousness. "Just family stuff." "What kind of family stuff?" "Nothing specific, just checking in." "You're lying." I studied her face, seeing the telltale signs. The way she touched her earring looked slightly to the left. "There's something else going on here. Something you're not telling me." "You're being paranoid now. Maybe you should look into therapy too. It could help both you and Tommy." "Don't deflect. What else have you and Mom and Dad been discussing in these secret meetings?" "They're not secret. You just weren't invited." The casualness of her cruelty took my breath away. "Because you were talking about my son behind my back. Because you get defensive and emotional, like right now. Any mother would be emotional about her sister trying to sabotage her child." "Sabotage? Really, Sherry? You think I have nothing better to do than sabotage a 7-year-old? Then explain it to me. Help me understand why you've spent 6 months documenting every time my son acts like a normal child. Why you've convinced our parents he's some kind of problem. Why you stood by while they turned us away on Christmas Eve." Lauren picked up her coffee mug, taking a long sip before responding. "Maybe the problem is that you think his behavior is normal." "It is normal. For you, maybe, but some of us have higher standards for our children." The superiority in her voice made me see red. "Higher standards. Your daughter ate paste last week. Should I start a file?" "She's 5. Yeah, and Tommy's 7. When does childhood end in your world, Lauren? 6'5". Should they come out of the womb with perfect table manners? You're impossible to talk to when you're like this." "Like what? Defending my son against baseless accusations?" I clutched the folder to my chest. "This isn't over. Whatever you're really up to, I'm gonna find out." "There's nothing to find out. I'm just a concerned aunt and sister." "No, you're not. I don't know what you are anymore. But you're not the sister I grew up with. I opened her front door. That sister would never do this to me. To Tommy. Maybe that sister got tired of pretending everything was fine, Lauren called after me. I turned back one last time, pretending what was fine, but she'd already closed the door. Sitting in my car outside Lauren's house, I spread the papers from the folder across my passenger seat. Reading them again, a pattern emerged that I'd missed in my initial shock. Many of the entries mentioned specific dates and times when Lauren couldn't possibly have been present. Family gatherings she didn't attend, playdates at the park when she was supposedly at work. Who else was watching? Who else was reporting back to her? My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Tommy's fine, asking when you're coming back. He wants to show you the fort we built. My sweet, normal, enthusiastic boy. Building forts, making friends, being exactly who he should be at 7 years old. I looked back at Lauren's perfect house with its perfect decorations and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December morning. My sister was playing some kind of game, and she'd made my son her pawn. But what was the game, and more importantly, what was the prize? 2 weeks into January, I found myself in my attic on a gray Sunday afternoon. Tommy was at a birthday party, and I decided to look for photos from my own childhood to remind myself of happier times with my family. What I found instead changed everything. I'd pulled down a box labeled Estate Documents, Grandma Rose that had been shoved behind Christmas decorations. I barely remembered putting it up there after her funeral 3 years ago. We'd each received copies of various papers, and I'd been too grief-stricken at the time to go through them thoroughly. Sitting cross-legged on the dusty attic floor, I opened the box. Inside were sympathy cards, funeral programs, and a manila envelope marked legal documents, important. My hands were already dusty as I opened it, expecting to find copies of things I'd already seen. The first few pages were familiar. Grandma Rose's will, which had left her house to be sold and profits split between her children. Some life insurance paperwork. Then I found a document I'd never seen before, paperback clipped to a letter in Grandma's handwriting. Revocable living trust for the benefit of Rose Elizabeth Hartley's first male grandchild. I read it once, then again, then a third time, my heart pounding harder with each pass. The trust established 20 years ago when none of us had children, yet set aside $400,000 for the first male grandchild who shall carry forth the Hartley family name. The money would be held until the child's 18th birthday, accumulating interest to be used for education or establishing a career. Tommy. My Tommy was the only boy among the grandchildren. Grandma's letter explained her reasoning in her neat cursive. While I love all my future grandchildren equally, I remember the struggle of being a woman in my time. This trust ensures the Hartley name continues and provides opportunity for education and advancement. Times may change, but family legacy endures. Old-fashioned? Yes. But Grandma Rose had grown up in a different era when women took their husbands' names and family names could disappear. She'd been the last Hartley of her line until she had children. I set the papers down with trembling hands. $400,000. With interest over the years, it would be even more by the time Tommy turned 18. Enough for college, graduate school, starting a business, whatever he dreamed of doing. Then another thought hit me like cold water. Lauren knew. She had to know. We'd all received these documents. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my photos until I found what I was looking for. Pictures from last summer's family barbecue. There was one of all the grandchildren together, Tommy in the middle, Lauren's 3 girls around him. Madison, Sophia, and little Emma. 3 girls who would never inherit this trust. Suddenly, Lauren's behavior made sickening sense. The documentation, the secret meetings, the campaign to paint Tommy as disturbed. If Tommy was deemed unfit to inherit, if he had documented behavioral problems, if he needed special care, if I was seen as an incompetent mother, what would happen to the trust? I scrambled through more papers until I found it. a clause in subsection 3b. Should the beneficiary be deemed unable to manage said funds due to mental incapacity, developmental disability, or other impairment, as determined by a court of law, the trust shall be dissolved and funds distributed according to the secondary terms outlined below. The secondary terms split the money among all grandchildren equally. My stomach churned. I ran to the attic window and threw it open, gulping in cold air. Lauren wasn't just being cruel, she was trying to steal my son's inheritance. But she couldn't do it alone. She'd need documentation, medical opinions, legal standing. She'd need our parents on her side. I went back to the papers, searching for more clues. In the bottom of the box, I found printed emails from 6 months ago, around the time Lauren had started her documentation. The first was from Lauren to someone named Patricia Edmonds. Thanks for lunch today. I'd love to discuss your thoughts on childhood behavioral assessments when you have time. As I mentioned, this is a delicate family matter. Patricia Edmonds. I Googled her immediately. Child psychologist specializing in behavioral disorders. Another email, this one to our parents. I've been researching options for Tommy. There are several specialists who could provide evaluations. I know it's hard to accept, but early intervention is crucial. I'm thinking of his future. All our futures. All our futures, meaning her daughter's futures, their financial futures. My phone rang, startling me. Sarah's name appeared on the screen. "Hey, just wanted to let you know Tommy's doing great at the party," she said. "He organized all the kids into a dinosaur hunt game. They love him." "Of course they do," I murmured, watching my sweet boy through someone's Instagram story leading a pack of laughing children around the backyard. "Everything okay? You sound weird." "I just discovered why my sister's been trying to convince everyone Tommy has problems." I gave her the abbreviated version. Sarah whistled low. 400,000. That's motive for a lot worse than family backstabbing. I feel sick. She's been planning this for months, getting our parents involved, documenting everything, even researching psychologists. I closed my eyes. What kind of person tries to steal from a 7-year-old? The kind who's desperate or greedy, or both. Sarah paused. "You need a lawyer, Sherry, yesterday." She was right. I couldn't fight this alone, not when Lauren had been building her case for 6 months. After hanging up, I carefully photographed every document in the box. Then I noticed something else. A small appointment card that must have fallen out of the envelope. Edmonds and Associates, Child Behavioral Health, with an appointment date from last month. But the patient name wasn't Tommy, it was Lauren. Why would Lauren have an appointment at a child psychologist's office? I called the office knowing they'd be closed on Sunday, but hoping for voicemail information. The message was standard, except for one line. "We also provide expert testimony for custody evaluations and inheritance capacity assessments." Inheritance capacity assessments. I sank back onto the attic floor, surrounded by the evidence of my family's betrayal. This wasn't just about making Tommy look bad. This was about building a legal case to challenge his capacity to inherit. At 7 years old. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Haven't heard from you since Christmas. Your father and I would like to discuss Tommy's situation. Please call." Tommy's situation, not "we miss you" or "let's work this out." Tommy's situation, like he was a problem to be solved rather than their grandchild. I typed back, "I know about Grandma's trust. I know what Lauren's trying to do. How could you—" The typing indicator appeared and disappeared several times. Finally, "It's not what you think. Come to dinner Thursday, without Tommy." Without Tommy. Always without Tommy now. "No, if Tommy's not welcome, neither am I." This time her response was quick. "You're being irrational. This is exactly what we were concerned about." "Well, concerned or what Lauren told you to be concerned about." No response. I gathered up all the documents, my mind racing. Lauren must have significant debts or financial problems to go to these lengths. The perfect house, the perfect life. Was it all a facade? Back in my home office, I did something I'd never thought I'd do. I paid for a comprehensive background check on my own sister. While waiting for the results, I called Mark Winters, a lawyer friend from college. Family trust dispute, he said after I explained. Those get ugly, especially when there's this much money involved. She's trying to say my son is mentally unfit. He's 7, Mark. He's a normal, happy 7-year-old. Doesn't matter if she can get doctors to say otherwise. Has he ever been evaluated? Any school issues? Disciplinary problems? Nothing. He gets good grades, his teachers love him, he has friends. I pulled up Tommy's recent report card on my computer. Straight A's in everything except handwriting, and that's just because he rushes. Good. Document everything positive. Get letters from teachers, coaches, anyone who interacts with him regularly. Mark paused. And Sherry, don't let them near him without you present. If they're building a case, they could manipulate any interaction. After we hung up, I sat in my quiet office staring at the photo of Tommy on my desk. It was from his first day of 2nd grade, gap-toothed smile, bright with excitement, dinosaur backpack almost as big as he was. Lauren had looked at this beautiful, innocent child and seen dollar signs. She'd looked at her nephew and decided his inheritance was worth more than his well-being, worth more than our sisterhood, worth more than basic human decency. The background check results pinged into my inbox an hour later. I opened them with shaking fingers, and what I found made everything clear. 3 credit cards in collections, a second mortgage taken out 2 years ago, her husband's business filing for bankruptcy last year, estimated debt over $300,000. Lauren wasn't just greedy, she was drowning. And she was willing to drag my 7-year-old son down with her. The private investigator's office smelled like coffee and old leather. James Morrison had come highly recommended by Mark, my lawyer friend, and sitting across from his cluttered desk 3 weeks after discovering the trust, I understood why. The man looked like he'd seen everything and been surprised by nothing. Family investigations are always the hardest, he said, sliding a contract across to me. People rarely like what I find. I already don't like it, I replied, signing my name with a steady hand. I just need proof. I'd given him everything. The trust documents, Lauren's behavioral notes, the email trails, the appointment card. He'd listened without judgment, occasionally jotting notes in margins. Your instincts about legal meetings are probably correct, he said. If they're trying to challenge a trust, they'd need professional guidance. I'll start with local estate attorneys. 5 days later, he called me at work. Can you meet today? I have information you need to see. I left my desk early, telling my boss I had a family emergency. It wasn't a lie. Morrison had a folder of photographs waiting. The first showed my parents entering a building I recognized, Coleman and Associates, the most prominent estate law firm in our city. The timestamp read 3 months ago. They've been there 4 times, he said, flipping through more photos. Always together, sometimes with your sister. One photo made my breath catch. Lauren, my mother, and my father sitting at an outdoor cafe with a man in an expensive suit. They were leaning in papers spread on the table between them. That's Richard Coleman himself, Morrison explained. He doesn't take small cases. What else? My voice sounded hollow. He pulled out another set of documents. I have a contact at Coleman's firm. These are billing records. Sanitized of specific details but showing the scope of work. The papers showed hours of billable time, research into trust law, consultation on capacity challenges, document preparation. The dates went back 4 months. They've been planning this since August, I whispered. There's more. Morrison looked almost sympathetic. They hired a second firm last month, Brennan and Torres. They specialize in one thing. What? Custody evaluations and challenges. The room spun slightly. They're going after custody. It's a strategy. If you're deemed an unfit parent, it strengthens their case that Tommy shouldn't inherit. 2 birds, 1 stone. He slid another photo across. This was taken last week. The image showed my father leaving Brennan and Torres carrying a thick folder. I also tracked their communications. Morrison pulled out phone records. Your parents' call logs show extensive contact with your sister. We're talking daily calls, some lasting over an hour. I studied the highlighted entries, calls at 6 in the morning, calls late at night. A conference call that lasted 2 hours on the day before they banned Tommy from Christmas. But here's the interesting part, Morrison continued. 3 weeks ago, your mother called a Dr. Patricia Edmonds. Remember that name? The child psychologist Lauren was emailing. Right, your mother made an appointment, but not for Tommy. For a consultation about Tommy, she went alone. He showed me security footage from the medical building. My mother entering, looking around nervously, clutching her purse like a shield. I spoke to the receptionist. Your mother was asking about the process of having a child evaluated without parental consent. She was told it would require court intervention unless there was immediate danger. Which is why they need to prove I'm unfit, I said, the pieces falling into place. Exactly. Morrison leaned back. There's one more thing. This is from yesterday. The final photo showed all three of them, my parents and Lauren, at Coleman's office again, but this time there was a fourth person, a woman in a severe suit carrying a briefcase. Melinda Sharp, court-appointed guardian ad litem specialist. She's who you bring in when you're ready to file. File what? Petition for evaluation, custody challenge, trust dispute, maybe all three. Morrison closed the folder. They're not just thinking about this, Ms. Hartley. They're actively pursuing it. I sat in silence, absorbing the betrayal. My parents hadn't been manipulated or confused. They were co-conspirators. Why would they do this? I asked, though I wasn't expecting an answer. They have money. They don't need it. In my experience, it's rarely just about money. Sometimes it's about control. Sometimes it's about choosing sides. Sometimes people convince themselves they're doing the right thing. How is stealing from a child the right thing? Morrison shrugged. They've probably convinced themselves the money would be better distributed among all the grandchildren, that it's unfair for one child to get everything. Lauren's drowning in debt. Maybe they see it as helping her. By destroying my son. By telling themselves he won't be destroyed, that he'll be fine without the money, that they're actually helping him by getting him treatment for problems they've invented. He'd seen this before clearly. The human capacity for self-justification is limitless. Gathered the photos, my hands surprisingly steady. What do you recommend? Get your own lawyer. Document everything good about Tommy. Report cards, teacher testimonials, doctor reports. Don't let him be alone with any of them. He paused. And prepare yourself. This is going to get ugly. It's already ugly. It's going to get worse. I drove home in a daze, the photos on my passenger seat like evidence of a crime, which they were in a way. A crime against trust, against family, against an innocent child whose only sin was being born a boy. When I got home, Tommy was doing homework at the kitchen table, tongue poking out in concentration as he worked on math problems. How was your day, sweetheart? I asked, smoothing his hair. Good Mrs. Peterson says I can be line leader tomorrow because I helped Jake when he was sad about his dog. He beamed up at me, proud of his kindness. That's wonderful, baby. I'm proud of you. Oish, Mom. Are we going to see Grandma and Grandpa soon? I miss them. I swallowed hard. I don't know, honey. Maybe someday. Did I do something bad? Is that why they didn't want me at Christmas? No, sweetheart. You didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes adults make mistakes. Maybe if I say I'm sorry about the vase again, I could do chores to pay for it. My heart shattered. My baby was trying to figure out how to earn back love that should be unconditional, love that had been sold for the promise of money. That night, after Tommy was asleep, I called Mark. They've hired 2 firms, I told him. They're going to file something soon. Then, we file first, he said. Injunction against any evaluation without your consent. petition to confirm Tommy's status as beneficiary, maybe even restraining orders if they try to approach him at school. Restraining orders against my parents. The words felt surreal. They're trying to steal $400,000 from your son and potentially take custody. They're not acting like parents. He was right. The people who raised me, who taught me right from wrong, who said family came first, they were gone. In their place were strangers who saw my child as an obstacle to wealth. I pulled out the photos again, studying my mother's face as she left the psychologist's office. She looked determined. Not guilty, not conflicted. Determined. They'd made their choice. Now I had to make mine. Tommy's inheritance wasn't just money. It was Grandma Rose's legacy, her gift to him, her hope for his future. And I'd fight anyone who tried to take that away, even if that anyone was my own family. My phone rang at 10:30 on a Tuesday night 3 weeks after hiring the investigator. The caller ID showed Beth my cousin, who lived 2 hours away. We'd always been friendly, but not close. She usually kept her distance from family drama. Sherry, I'm sorry to call so late. She began, her voice strained. I heard about Christmas. I've been debating whether to tell you something. I muted the TV, giving her my full attention. Tell me what... Can we meet? This isn't a phone conversation. I'll drive to you this weekend if that works. The urgency in her voice made my pulse quicken. Of course! Saturday. I'll be there by noon. And Sherry, don't tell anyone I'm coming, especially not your parents or Lauren. Saturday arrived gray and drizzly. Tommy was at a friend's house for a play date, and I paced my living room waiting for Beth. When her car finally pulled up, I had coffee ready and my nerves wound tight. Beth looked tired, older than her 35 years. She hugged me at the door, holding on longer than usual. I should have called sooner, she said, settling onto my couch. I kept hoping I misunderstood what I heard. What did you hear? She wrapped her hands around her coffee mug like she needed the warmth. Remember the family barbecue in September at your parents' house? I nodded. It had been a normal gathering, or so I'd thought. Tommy had played with his cousins. Everyone had seemed happy. I went inside to use the bathroom, Beth continued. The one downstairs was occupied, so I went upstairs. When I came out, I heard voices from your parents' bedroom. The door was cracked, and I recognized Lauren's voice. She paused, visibly uncomfortable with sharing what she'd overheard. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but Lauren sounded upset. She was saying something about needing to move fast. That time was running out. Then I heard your mother say, "We need documentation, real documentation from real doctors." My stomach tightened. Go on. Your dad said something about finding the right doctors, ones who would see what needed to be seen. Beth's face was pale. Then Lauren said, and I'll never forget this, Tommy's a sweet kid, but sweet doesn't pay bills. If we can get him diagnosed with ADHD or something more serious, the trust provisions kick in? They actually said that out loud, clear as day. Your mom asked if that was really necessary, and Lauren got sharp with her. Said necessity went out the window when creditors started calling. Beth set down her mug with shaking hands. Then your dad said they should start with ADHD and work up from there if needed. Build a pattern. I felt like I might be sick. Work up from there. Lauren had a list. She mentioned oppositional defiant disorder, autism spectrum, sensory processing disorder, anything that might stick. She said with enough evaluations, something would come up that they could use. But Tommy doesn't have any of those things. I know that. You know that. Beth leaned forward. But Lauren said with the right presentation to the right doctor, any active 7-year-old boy could fit some criteria, especially if the family is united in their concerns. I stood up, unable to sit still. They were planning to doctor shop, to keep taking him to different specialists until someone gave them the diagnosis they wanted. That's not the worst part. Beth's voice dropped. Your mother asked what would happen if you refused to cooperate, and your father said, then we go to court. a concerned grandparent petition, judges listen when multiple family members express worry about a child's well-being. They were planning this in September, 3 months before Christmas. I ran my hands through my hair, while smiling at me, playing with Tommy acting normal. There's more. Beth pulled out her phone, after I heard that I started paying attention at family gatherings, recording things just in case. I felt guilty about it, but something felt so wrong. She played an audio file. The quality was muffled, but I recognized the setting. Thanksgiving dinner. In the background, I could hear Tommy laughing with other kids. Then Lauren's voice closer to the recorder. Did you see him just now? Can't even sit still for grace. Classic hyperactivity. My mother's response. I'm noting it. The more examples we have, the better. My father. Make sure to mention how he interrupted Pastor Williams at Rose's memorial service. He was 4, I said to Beth. He asked if great-grandma could see us from heaven. Beth stopped the recording. I have 3 more from that day. Every normal kid thing Tommy did, they twisted into a symptom. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I kept hoping I was wrong, that maybe they'd realize how crazy this was and stop. She looked miserable. Then I heard about Christmas, and I knew they'd gone through with it. I'm so sorry, Sherry. I sat back down, processing everything. Do you know anything about specific doctors they contacted? One name came up repeatedly, Dr. Marcus Fillmore. Lauren seemed excited about him, said he was known for thorough diagnoses and understanding family dynamics. I grabbed my laptop and searched his name. Dr. Marcus Fillmore, child psychiatrist. The reviews were mixed. Some parents praised him. Others complained he was too quick to diagnose, too eager to prescribe medication. Look at this, I said, showing Beth. 3 malpractice suits in 10 years, all settled out of court. Lauren would have done her research, Beth said grimly. Found someone willing to see what she needed him to see. We sat in silence for a moment before Beth spoke again. There's one more thing. Last week, I ran into your Aunt Patricia, your dad's sister. She asked if I knew why your parents were asking about Tommy's early development. Apparently, they called her trying to find out if she remembered any concerning incidents from when he was a toddler. He was a perfect baby. Happy, healthy, met all his milestones. I felt tears threatening. They're trying to rewrite his entire history. Patricia told them the same thing. She said Tommy was delightful as a toddler, curious and active but completely normal. Your dad apparently got frustrated and said she wasn't remembering clearly. They're getting desperate. Or determined. Beth reached for my hand. Sherry, I think you need to know. Lauren's been telling people you're unstable, that you're in denial about Tommy's problems and it's affecting your judgment. What people? Extended family, friends from church, anyone who will listen. Beth squeezed my hand. She's laying groundwork. If this goes to court, she wants character witnesses. I thought about all the recent family events where people had seemed oddly distant. The strange looks, the careful conversations. Lauren had been poisoning the well for months. Why are you telling me all this? I asked. You could have stayed out of it. Beth's eyes filled with tears. Because 20 years ago, I watched this family do something similar to my brother Robert. Remember, he was supposed to inherit Grandpa's business, but suddenly everyone was concerned about his drinking problem and instability. He had 2 beers at a 4th of July picnic, and by Christmas, the family had convinced Grandpa he was an alcoholic. I remembered vaguely. I'd been young, but Robert had gone from family favorite to black sheep seemingly overnight. Robert lost everything and moved to California. He's doing great now, owns 3 restaurants, but he never came back. Never forgave them. Beth wiped her eyes. I was too young and scared to speak up then. I won't make that mistake again. What happened to Grandpa's business? Your father got it. Sold it 5 years later for triple what it was worth. Beth's laugh was bitter. Family patterns, right? My blood ran cold. This wasn't the first time. My father had done this before. Beth, would you be willing to share what you heard with my lawyer, the recordings, too? Already planned on it. She pulled out a USB drive. Everything's on here. Dates, times, recordings, even some photos of their documentation. Lauren left her notebook out once. I took the drive like it was a lifeline, which it was. They're going to be furious when they find out you helped me, I warned. Let them. I'm tired of keeping family secrets that hurt innocent people. Beth stood to leave. That little boy doesn't deserve this. Neither do you. After she left, I sat with Tommy's photo album looking at pictures from the past year. Birthday parties where he shared his cake with everyone. Soccer games where he helped up opponents who fell. Art class projects he made for others. Every photo showed a normal, kind, enthusiastic child, the child my family was trying to pathologize for money. But now I had proof. Beth's recordings, Morrison's photographs, the paper trail of their deception. They thought they'd been so careful, so clever. They hadn't counted on witnesses with consciences. I texted Mark, major development. Can you meet tomorrow? His response was immediate. Name the time. My family had underestimated me. They saw a single mother who would crumble under pressure, who would doubt herself when the authority figures questioned her child. They were wrong. I looked at the USB drive in my hand. Such a small thing to hold so much betrayal, but also, potentially, so much justice. The revelation about Lauren's surveillance hit me on an ordinary Wednesday. Tommy had asked if he could look at videos from last summer's beach trip on my tablet, and I'd handed it over without thinking. 20 minutes later, he came to me with a puzzled expression. Oh, Mom, why are there so many videos of just me at Aunt Lauren's house? I looked at the screen frowning. He'd somehow ended up in Lauren's cloud storage through a shared family account. Video after video showed Tommy at various family gatherings, but they weren't normal family videos. These were focused solely on him, often from odd angles, catching him mid-movement or mid-expression. Let me see, honey. I took the tablet, my heart rate climbing. Why don't you go play in your room for a bit? Once he was gone, I dove deeper into the shared storage. What I found made my skin crawl. Dozens of videos, all featuring Tommy, all filmed surreptitiously. The dates went back 8 months. One showed him running through Lauren's backyard labeled excessive hyperactivity, cannot control impulses. Another caught him arguing with Madison over a toy titled aggressive behavior with cousin, concerning escalation. I watched video after video, seeing my son's normal childhood moments twisted into something sinister. A clip of him excitedly telling a story became cannot modulate voice volume or maintain appropriate boundaries. Him spinning in circles on the grass was repetitive behaviors indicating possible spectrum disorder. Then I found something that made me pause. In several videos, I could hear Lauren directing from behind the camera, Madison, go ask Tommy to share that toy. Or, Sophia, tell Tommy that game is too loud. She was creating situations to film. I immediately called my friend Sarah. Her daughter Emma was in Madison's class. Random question, I said, trying to sound casual. Has Madison ever mentioned anything about filming Tommy or being asked to... Actually, yes, Sarah said slowly. Emma said Madison told her it was a secret game her mom invented. Something about catching Tommy being naughty for points. Points. That's all Emma knew. She thought it was weird and mean. Sarah paused. Why, what's going on? I gave her the abbreviated version. Sarah's sharp intake of breath told me everything. That's sick, Sherry. Using her own kids to spy on Tommy. I need to talk to Madison. Would Emma know when she might be at the playground without Lauren? Tuesday after school. Lauren drops her at dance and doesn't pick her up for 2 hours. The older kids usually play at the park next door. Tuesday afternoon found me at the park pushing Tommy on the swings while keeping an eye out for Madison. When I spotted her with a group of girls, I sent Tommy to play on the climbing structure and approached casually. Hi, Madison. How's dance going? She smiled at me, but it was guarded. Hi, Aunt Sherry. It's good. I wanted to thank you for being so patient with Tommy. I know 7-year-old boys can be a lot sometimes. Her face relaxed slightly. Tommy's fun. He taught me to catch lizards. He mentioned you guys have been playing some new games at your house. Madison's expression immediately closed off. I'm not supposed to talk about that. It's okay, sweetheart. You're not in trouble. I just want to understand. She glanced around nervously, then whispered, Mom said it was important, for Tommy's own good, to help him get better. Better from what? From being too wild. Mom says he needs special help, but you don't know it. Her words came out in a rush. She gives me and Sophia extra screen time when we get good videos. My heart broke for this child manipulated into betraying her cousin. What makes a video good? When Tommy's being loud or running or not sharing or arguing? She picked at her dance bag strap. Mom says we're helping build evidence, like detectives. Madison, honey, did your mom ever ask you to do things to make Tommy upset or to cause problems? Her silence was answer enough. It's not your fault, I said gently. You were doing what your mom asked, but Tommy doesn't need special help, sweetie. He's just a regular kid. Really? Her voice was small. Mom said he was sick in his brain. I knelt down to her level. Your mom made a mistake. Tommy's brain is perfectly healthy. He's just an energetic, happy little boy. Madison's eyes filled with tears. I don't want to film him anymore. It feels mean. You don't have to do anything that feels wrong, and Madison, thank you for being honest with me. That evening, I called each family member who'd babysat Tommy in the past year. The pattern quickly emerged. My Aunt Carol mentioned Lauren had asked her to keep special track of Tommy's behavior during a family reunion. My mother-in-law revealed Lauren had offered to pay her to babysit Tommy, but only if she'd document any concerning behaviors. The most revealing conversation was with my teenage nephew Marcus Lauren's stepson from her husband's first marriage. Aunt Sherry, I've been wanting to tell someone, he said when I called. Lauren's been obsessed with Tommy for months. She has this whole folder on her laptop. You've seen it. She left it open once. It's got videos, photos, even audio recordings. Some of it she didn't even take. She got them from other people. He lowered his voice. I heard her on the phone once talking about how she needed more dramatic footage. She was mad because all the videos just showed Tommy being normal. Marcus, would you be willing to tell this to a lawyer? I don't know. I still have to live here for 2 more years. He sounded scared. She's already mad at me for refusing to film Tommy at Christmas. That's why I wasn't at the house when you came. You refused. She wanted me to follow him around with my phone, try to get him worked up, then film the meltdown. I told her that was messed up. His voice hardened. She took my car keys for a month. I'm sorry she put you in that position. That wasn't fair to you or Tommy. Aunt Sherry, there's something else. I heard her talking to my dad about money problems, like serious problems. Dad asked her how bad it was, and she started crying, said something about losing the house if they couldn't figure something out. After we hung up, I compiled everything I'd learned. The surveillance network Lauren had created was extensive and deliberate. She turned family members into unwitting spies, her own children into accomplices, all to paint a picture of a disturbed child who didn't exist. But the cracks were showing. Madison felt guilty. Marcus was disgusted. Even the adults who'd participated seemed uncomfortable when pressed. I opened my laptop and created my own folder, Evidence of Conspiracy. Into it went screenshots of all Lauren's videos and their twisted labels, recordings of my conversations with witnesses, the dates and times of every documented incident, cross-references showing how normal behaviors were reframed. Then I did something else. I reached out to every teacher, coach, and activity leader Tommy had ever had. Within 2 days, I had 17 character references, glowing reports about his kindness, his enthusiasm, his completely age-appropriate behavior. Mrs. Peterson, his second-grade teacher, was particularly incensed when I explained the situation. That boy is one of my brightest, kindest students, she said. If anyone tries to claim otherwise in court, I'll be there to set them straight. The soccer coach offered similar support. Tommy's the kid who helps others up when they fall. He's competitive but fair. Classic 7-year-old energy channeled in all the right ways. By the end of the week, I had a counter folder that dwarfed Lauren's. The truth, it turned out, was a lot easier to document than lies. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Megan Lauren's oldest daughter left a note in my mailbox. Aunt Sherry, I'm sorry about the videos. I saved copies of everything on this drive, including the ones Mom deleted because they showed Tommy being too normal. I also recorded Mom coaching us on what to film. I don't want to hurt my mom, but what she's doing is wrong. Tommy's my favorite cousin. Please don't let them hurt him. Megan. Inside the envelope was a flash drive. That night, after Tommy was asleep, I watched Megan's recordings. There was Lauren instructing her daughters like a director. If Tommy starts playing nicely, try to redirect him to something more active. We need energy, not calm. Remember, we're looking for defiance. If he obeys too quickly, that doesn't help us. Sophia, if you cry after he tags you in the game, I'll take you for ice cream. We need to show he's too rough. The worst was a video of Lauren reviewing footage with her daughters, praising them for catching Tommy's bad moments and criticizing them for recording him being helpful or calm. This isn't useful, she said in one clip, deleting a video of Tommy helping Madison with homework. We need problems, not solutions. I backed up everything in triplicate, sent copies to my lawyer, and sat in my dark living room processing the magnitude of what my sister had done. She hadn't just conspired against Tommy. She'd corrupted her own children in the process. But her own children had more integrity than she did. They'd preserve the truth even when it meant betraying their mother. The investigation I'd started to defend my son had revealed something larger, a family so twisted by greed that they'd turned children into weapons. But it had also revealed unexpected allies, people with consciences who wouldn't let a 7-year-old boy be destroyed for money. The call from Tommy's school came on a Thursday morning that started like any other. I'd just dropped him off and was heading to work when Principal Martinez's name appeared on my phone. Mrs. Hartley, could you come back to the school? There's something we need to discuss about Tommy. My heart dropped. Is he okay? Is he hurt? He's fine, but this is important. It concerns some paperwork we received. 20 minutes later, I sat in her office while she pulled out a manila folder. Her expression was serious but sympathetic. Yesterday afternoon, we received these forms requesting a comprehensive psychological evaluation for Tommy. She began sliding papers across to me. According to these documents, you're requesting assessment for multiple behavioral and learning disorders. I looked at the papers, confusion giving way to horror. There was my signature at the bottom of each form. Except it wasn't. I didn't sign these. I never filled out these forms. My hand shook as I examined the forged signature. Close to mine, but with telltale differences in the way the S curved and the I was dotted. Principal Martinez nodded. We suspected as much. That's why I called you immediately instead of processing them. You suspected. Mrs. Hartley, Tommy is one of our star students. Straight A's, perfect attendance, helps tutor younger children in reading, serves as a peer mediator. She pulled out another folder, Tommy's actual school records. In my 20 years of education, if Tommy needs psychological evaluation, then so does every child in America. Relief washed over me. So you won't process these? Absolutely not, but there's more you need to know. She turned to her computer. We have security footage of who dropped these off. She swiveled the monitor toward me. The grainy footage showed the school's front entrance. A woman in a baseball cap and sunglasses approached the front desk. Even with the attempted disguise, I recognized Lauren's walk, her mannerisms, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear. That's my sister. We thought it might be a family member given the last name. She told our receptionist she was dropping off important medical forms you'd forgotten to submit. Martinez fast-forwarded to another angle. Here's the interesting part. The footage showed Lauren at the desk, glancing around nervously. When the receptionist turned to answer the phone, Lauren quickly shoved the envelope across the desk and practically ran out. She didn't want to answer any questions, I observed. Exactly. Our receptionist found it odd enough to flag it for me. Martinez leaned back. Mrs. Hartley, is there something going on that I should know about? This seems like more than family drama. I made a split-second decision to trust her. I explained about the trust fund, the conspiracy, Lauren's surveillance. Martinez's expression grew increasingly shocked. Oh, $400,000, she repeated, and they're trying to paint Tommy as disturbed to steal it. That's the short version, yes. She was quiet for a moment, then pulled out her phone. Mrs. Chen, please come to my office with the visitor log from yesterday. While we waited, she turned back to the forms. These are sophisticated forgeries. She did research. These are real forms we use, just outdated versions. And the diagnoses she's requesting evaluation for, she shook her head. ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, autism, spectrum disorder, sensory processing disorder, intermittent explosive disorder. It's like she went through the DSM-5 and picked everything that might possibly stick. Mrs. Chen arrived with the log. Lauren had signed in under a false name, Sarah Collins. She gave a fake driver's license number too, Mrs. Chen noted. I remember thinking something was off, but she seemed in such a hurry. Mrs. Chen, could you write up exactly what happened? What she said, how she acted, Martinez asked. While Mrs. Chen wrote her statement, Martinez pulled out more papers. There's something else. These forms reference previous concerns from teachers. They quote supposed conversations with Mrs. Peterson and Mr. Garcia. Tommy's teachers. Yes, so I called them both this morning. She smiled grimly. Not only did those conversations never happen, but both teachers are furious. Mrs. Peterson used some very colorful language about anyone who would try to pathologize Tommy. The forms contain false statements from teachers, fabricated completely. Mrs. Peterson wants to write a formal rebuttal. Mr. Garcia mentioned something about defamation of his professional reputation. Martinez made more notes. Your sister didn't just forge signatures, she fabricated entire professional opinions. I thought about the legal implications. This is criminal, isn't it? Not just family drama, but actual fraud. I'm required to report suspected fraud involving student records, Martinez confirmed, but I wanted to speak with you first. Report it, I said firmly. I'm documenting everything for my lawyer anyway. She nodded and pulled out official school letterhead. I'm going to write a comprehensive statement about Tommy's actual performance and behavior. I'll include his test scores, peer reviews, teacher evaluations, and my own observations. Thank you. That would be incredibly helpful. I'm also going to recommend that Tommy receive the Student Excellence Award at the end-of-year ceremony, she added. It's not favoritism. He's genuinely earned it through his grades and peer mentoring. But having that official recognition might help your case. As she typed, she asked, has your sister attempted to contact any of Tommy's teachers directly? Not that I know of. Why? Mrs. Peterson mentioned getting an odd email last month from someone claiming to be a concerned family member asking about Tommy's classroom behavior. She didn't respond because it violated our communication protocols. All concerns go through parents first. Did she keep the email? She did. Want me to have her forward it to you? Please. An hour later, I left with a thick folder of evidence, the forged document security footage, Still's witness statements, and Principal Martinez's glowing report about Tommy. But more importantly, I had allies who were as outraged as I was. My phone buzzed as I reached my car. Email from Mrs. Peterson with the forwarded message from Lauren. She'd created a fake email address but had signed it, a concerned aunt. The email was a masterpiece of manipulation, asking leading questions. Have you noticed excessive energy? Difficulty following instructions? Aggressive behavior toward classmates? Inability to complete tasks? Mrs. Peterson had added her own note. I didn't respond to this garbage, but I kept it because something felt off. Tommy is literally the child I point to when showing others how to behave properly. If your sister wants a fight, she's got one. Janet Peterson. I sat in my car reading and rereading everything. Lauren had been so careful, so thorough, creating fake emails, forging documents, building an elaborate false narrative, but she'd made crucial mistakes. She'd underestimated the integrity of Tommy's teachers. She'd assumed they'd either cooperate or stay silent. She'd thought her forged documents would be processed without question. Most importantly, she'd underestimated how much Tommy was genuinely loved and respected at his school. My phone rang. Mark, my lawyer. Shay, Sherry. I just got a call from the district attorney's office. Something about forged school documents. Principal Martinez must have already reported it. This changes everything, he said, excitement in his voice. Forging educational documents, falsifying teacher statements, fraudulent misrepresentation. These are criminal charges. Your custody case just became a criminal investigation. What does that mean for Tommy? It means your sister just handed us the ammunition to not only protect his inheritance, but potentially have her arrested for fraud. He paused. How do you feel about that? Her facing criminal charges. I thought about Tommy asking why his grandparents didn't want him at Christmas, about the months of surveillance and manipulation, about her corrupting her own children to spy on their cousin. I feel like justice might actually exist, I said. Good, because this is about to escalate quickly. The DA will want to interview you, see all your evidence. Are you ready for that? I looked at the folder beside me, thought about the USB drives at home, the witness statements, the recordings. I've been ready since Christmas Eve, and I told him, they came for my son. Now I'm coming for them. After we hung up, I sat in the school parking lot for another moment. Through the window, I could see Tommy's classroom. He was probably working on his morning math tongue, poking out in concentration, completely unaware that his school had just protected him from his own family's betrayal. Principal Martinez appeared at the school entrance and gave me a small wave. Behind her, Mrs. Peterson looked out from her classroom window and gave me a thumbs up. They say it takes a village to raise a child. Today, I learned it also takes a village to protect one. The call came on a rainy Saturday evening 2 weeks after the forged documents incident. I didn't recognize the number, but something made me answer. Sherry, this is Aunt Margaret, your father's sister. I nearly dropped the phone. Margaret had been estranged from the family for as long as I could remember. She sent Christmas cards but never visited, called on birthdays but kept conversations short. I heard about what they're doing to Tommy. She continued, her voice heavy with an emotion I couldn't quite place. Beth called me, told me everything. I need to see you. Aunt Margaret, I appreciate the concern, but this isn't the first time, Sherry. Her words cut through my polite deflection. They did this before, 20 years ago, to my son Robert. The room seemed to tilt. What? Can I come by tomorrow? I have things you need to see. Documents. Proof. She paused. I've carried this guilt for 2 decades. I won't watch them destroy another child. Tommy was at a sleepover the next day when Margaret arrived. I barely recognized her. The years had turned her hair silver, but her eyes were sharp and determined. She carried a worn leather briefcase that looked as old as I was. We sat at my kitchen table, coffee growing cold between us as she opened the briefcase with shaking hands. Robert was 22. She began pulling out yellowed papers. Fresh out of college, engaged to a lovely girl named Diana. Your grandfather had promised him the family business, Hartley Construction. It was worth about $2 million at the time. She slid a photo across to me. Robert looked like a younger version of my father, but with kinder eyes and an easier smile. What happened? Your father wanted the business. He was older, thought he deserved it. But Papa had been clear. Robert had the head for it. Got his degree in business management, spent summers working every position from laborer to foreman. Margaret's voice grew bitter. David got a degree in philosophy and spent summers backpacking through Europe. She pulled out more documents. Letters, legal papers, medical forms that made my blood run cold. It started small. David began mentioning Robert's drinking at family dinners. Robert had a beer or two at gatherings, nothing unusual for a young man. But David would count every drink mentioned every time Robert seemed unsteady or slurred his words. Like Lauren documenting Tommy, I whispered. Exactly like that. Then came the concerned family meetings. Your parents, newlyweds then, would host dinners where the topic always somehow turned to Robert's problem. Nancy was pregnant with you, and David would express worry about Robert being around the baby if he couldn't control his drinking. She showed me a letter in my father's handwriting. Papa, I'm concerned about Robert's inability to maintain sobriety. Last week at dinner, he had 3 beers. When I expressed concern, he became defensive and agitated. This kind of denial is classic alcoholic behavior. 3 beers at a dinner party, I said flatly. It escalated from there. David found a doctor, Dr. Harold Stern, who was later stripped of his license for other issues, who was willing to diagnose Robert with alcohol dependency based solely on family reports. No tests, no actual evaluation. Just David's word. The parallels to Dr. Fillmore were chilling. Then came the interventions. Margaret continued. Ambush style. They'd invite Robert over, and suddenly the living room would be full of concerned family members. David had coached them all on what to say, even got Robert's fiancée worried. She pulled out a photo of what looked like one of these interventions. Robert sat in the center looking bewildered and defensive, while family members surrounded him with stern faces. The final straw was when David hired a private investigator to follow Robert. Got photos of him at bars with friends, completely normal social drinking, but presented out of context. One shows Robert stumbling. He'd tripped on uneven pavement. Another showed him passed out in his car. He was checking his phone with his head down. Just like Lauren's videos of Tommy running and playing I breathed. The patterns are identical because David taught her well. Margaret's laugh was hollow. The student surpassed the master, though. The forged documents are new. What happened to Robert? Papa was in his 70s, starting to have memory issues. David convinced him that Robert needed tough love. Either Robert admitted his problem and went to rehab, giving up any claim to the business, or the family would cut him off entirely. Margaret wiped at her eyes. Robert refused to admit to a problem he didn't have, so they destroyed him. She showed me newspaper clippings. David leaked the story to business associates. Hartley Ayres' alcohol problem threatens family business. Robert lost his job after his fiancée left him when the pressure got too intense, and Papa officially disinherited him. Where is Robert now? California. Changed his last name to his mother's maiden name, Morrison. Has a beautiful family, owns 3 successful restaurants. She smiled sadly. He's happy, but he's never forgiven any of us, including me. Oh, why including you? Margaret's face crumbled. Because I knew David was lying and I stayed silent. I was young, newly divorced, dependent on family support for my kids. David made it clear that supporting Robert meant losing access to family resources. She grabbed my hand. I chose financial security over my nephew. I regretted it every day since. But you have proof David orchestrated it. She pushed the entire briefcase toward me. Letters, recordings I made during some family meetings, the PI's real reports before David doctored them, even a confession from Dr. Stern before he died. He admitted David paid him to diagnose Robert without proper evaluation. I rifled through the papers, seeing 20-year-old evidence of the exact same playbook being used against Tommy. This is incredible. There's more. Margaret pulled out a final folder. I've kept track of David over the years. This isn't his only victim. She showed me notes about other family members who'd mysteriously fallen from grace when they stood to inherit something valuable. A cousin whose small trust fund went to David after she was deemed irresponsible following a manufactured scandal. An uncle whose share of a property was signed over after David convinced him he was showing signs of dementia. Your father is a predator, Margaret said bluntly. He preys on family members who have what he wants, and now he's teaching Lauren to do the same. Why help me now after staying quiet so long? Because I'm 73 years old and I can't take this secret to my grave. Because Tommy is 7 and innocent. Because I failed Robert, but maybe I can save Tommy. She straightened her shoulders. And because I'm financially independent now. David can't threaten me anymore. Will you testify if this goes to court? I'll do more than that. She pulled out her phone and showed me a contact. Robert Morrison. He's been waiting 20 years for justice. I called him last week, told him what's happening to Tommy. He wants to help. He's not angry with you. Oh, he's furious with me, has been for 20 years. But he's more furious with David, and he has resources now. Lawyers, investigators, connections. She smiled grimly. Turns out, revenge is a dish best served with a side of excellent legal representation. I looked at the evidence spread across my table. 20 years of manipulation, greed, and betrayal, but also proof that my father had done this before, that there was a pattern that could be exposed. Aunt Margaret, do you think my mother knows about Robert, about the pattern? Margaret considered this. Nancy was young when Robert was destroyed. David probably told her his version and she believed it, but she's participated since then. She chooses to see what David wants her to see. And Lauren? Lauren's different. She's not being manipulated. She's a willing participant. David recognized a kindred spirit and trained her well. Margaret gathered the photos of Robert. But even predators make mistakes when they're desperate, and from what Beth told me, Lauren's very desperate. After Margaret left, I sat surrounded by evidence of generational betrayal. My father hadn't just decided to steal from Tommy, he'd been stealing from family members for decades, and now he was passing his methods to Lauren like some twisted inheritance. But Margaret had given me more than evidence. She'd given me a pattern to expose, a history to reveal, and potentially an ally in Robert who'd survived the same treatment. I picked up my phone and dialed Mark. How do you feel about adding racketeering to our case? Because I just discovered this isn't my father's first rodeo. As I waited for him to answer, I looked at the photo of young Robert betrayed and banished for a problem he didn't have. Then I looked at Tommy's school photo on my refrigerator. Bright-eyed, gap-toothed, and unaware of the danger circling him. Not this time, not my son. The Hartley family tradition of destroying their own for money was about to end, and I had 20 years of evidence to make sure of it. The summons came through my mother naturally. A text on a Thursday morning, formal and cold, family meeting regarding Thomas's welfare. Saturday, the 2 p.m. our house. Your attendance is mandatory. Mandatory, as if they had any authority over me. I immediately called Mark. They're making their move. Emergency family meeting about Tommy's welfare. Perfect, he said, surprising me. Go, but go prepared. You want me to walk into their ambush? I want you to document their ambush. Wisconsin is a one-party consent state for recording. Get everything. He paused. And Sherry, take backup. Not physical backup. Witness backup. Someone they won't expect. I knew exactly who to call. Saturday arrived overcast and humid. I parked down the street from my parents' house watching as extended family members arrived. Cousins I hadn't seen in months. Great-aunt Dorothy from Milwaukee. My father's golf buddy Judge Harrison, retired but still influential. They'd stacked the deck with authority figures and family members they'd been poisoning against me for months. What they didn't expect was the silver Honda that pulled up behind me. Aunt Margaret emerged, followed by a man I recognized from photos. Robert Morrison, formerly Robert Hartley. My father's first victim had come home. "You ready for this?" Robert asked, adjusting his expensive suit. The scared young man from the photos was gone, replaced by a successful businessman with steel in his eyes. "Are you?" I asked. "They don't know you're coming." His smile was sharp. "I've been ready for 20 years. Margaret took my arm. "Remember, they're expecting you to be emotional defensive. Don't give them that. Be calm, collected, and let them hang themselves." I checked my phone's recording app one more time, then we walked to the house together. I rang the doorbell instead of using my key. I was a guest here now, not family. My mother answered, her practiced smile faltering when she saw my companions. "Margaret, what are you doing here?" "Supporting my niece," Margaret said smoothly, pushing past her. "Surely family is welcome at a family meeting." The living room was arranged like a tribunal. My parents sat in their formal chairs, Lauren beside them with a stack of folders. Around the room, family members perched uncomfortably, clearly briefed on their roles. Every eye turned to Robert, but no one recognized him. 20 years and a different life had changed him too much. "Sherry," my father began, not standing to greet me. "Thank you for coming. Please sit." 3 chairs had been placed in the center of the room facing everyone else. An interrogation set up. "I'll stand," I said, noting how the camera angle would catch more faces this way. Suit yourself." David shuffled papers importantly. "We've called this meeting because we have serious concerns about Tommy's well-being." "Thomas," Lauren corrected, using his full name like it gave her authority. "We need to discuss his behavioral issues and your refusal to acknowledge them." "What behavioral issues?" I kept my voice level, almost bored. Lauren opened her first folder with a flourish. "I have documented evidence of hyperactivity, defiance, aggression, and possible developmental delays." "You have videos of a child playing," I countered. "I have professional opinions." She pulled out papers. "Dr. Fillmore has reviewed the materials and agrees evaluation is necessary." Dr. Fillmore, who lost his license in Maine for overdiagnosing children. Robert spoke for the first time, his voice carrying across the room. Every head swiveled to him. My father's face went through several expressions before settling on confusion. "I'm sorry, who are you?" David demanded. Robert stepped forward, and I saw the moment recognition flickered in my father's eyes. The blood drained from his face. "Hello, Uncle David. It's been a while." The room erupted. Cousins whispered, trying to place him. My mother gasped. Lauren looked between Robert and my father, clearly confused. "Rart," David's voice cracked. "What are you doing here?" "Returning a favor." Robert surveyed the room with cool eyes. "I see you've refined your methods. Same playbook, though. Concerned family meeting, stacked audience, fabricated evidence. Tell me, did you coach everyone on what to say about Sherry too, or just about Tommy?" "This has nothing to do with you." David tried to recover his authority. "Doesn't it?" Robert pulled out his own folder. "Because I have here the transcript from a remarkably similar meeting 20 years ago. Would you like me to read the parts where you expressed concern about my drinking problem? Or should we skip to where you presented doctored photos?" "That was different," my mother interjected weakly. "Was it Aunt Nancy? Because from where I'm standing, it looks identical, down to the same living room arrangement." Robert's voice hardened. "Except this time your victim is 7 years old." Great Aunt Dorothy spoke up, confused. "David, what's he talking about?" Margaret took over. 20 years ago, David orchestrated a campaign to convince everyone Robert was an alcoholic so he could steal the family business. Now, he's doing the same thing to Tommy to steal his inheritance." "That's a lie," David stood, face flushing. "Is it?" Margaret pulled out papers. "Because I have the letters you wrote, the payments to Dr. Stern, the private investigators' reports before and after you doctored them." The room shifted. Family members who'd come to support my parents now looked uncertain. Judge Harrison frowned deeply. Lauren tried to salvage the situation. This is ancient history. We're here about Thomas's current needs. You mean his trust fund, I interrupted. The $400,000 Grandma Rose left to him that you want for your debts. Gasps around the room. Several family members clearly didn't know about the trust. How dare you, Lauren sputtered. This is about his well-being. Really, then why did you forge documents at his school? I pulled out the principal's report. Why did you create fake email accounts to contact his teachers? Why did you train your daughters to spy on him? I have the security footage, Lauren. The school has already contacted the district attorney. The room erupted again. Judge Harrison stood. Forged documents, David, what is going on here? My father tried to speak, but Robert cut him off. What's going on is what David does. He identifies family members with inheritances, manufactures evidence of their unfitness, and steals what's theirs. He did it to me. He tried to do it to cousin Sarah. Remember her nervous breakdown, Judge Harrison? And now he's doing it to a 7-year-old boy. With Lauren's help, I added, because she owes over $300,000 and sees my son as her personal ATM. Enough, David roared. Get out of my house. Gladly. I looked around the room at my extended family. But first, you all should know that every word of this meeting is being recorded. Every lie, every admission, every threat against my 7-year-old son is documented. So please continue discussing his welfare. The district attorney will find it fascinating. Lauren lunged for my phone, but Margaret stepped between us. Touch her, and I'll have you arrested for assault to go with the fraud charges. My mother started crying. This wasn't supposed to happen like this. How is it supposed to happen? Mom, I asked. Was I supposed to roll over, let you declare my son mentally unfit, hand over his inheritance to save Lauren from her own choices? We just wanted what was fair, she sobbed. Fair. Robert's laugh was bitter. Like it was fair when you destroyed my life, when you let David convince everyone I was a drunk, when you chose money over your nephew. You're doing fine now, David said defensively. No thanks to any of you. Robert's voice could have cut glass. I rebuilt my life from nothing while you enjoyed the business you stole, but I'll be damned if I let you do it to another child. Judge Harrison moved toward the door. I've heard enough. David, I don't know what you thought you'd accomplish here, but I won't be party to whatever this is. He looked at me with something like apology. Sherry, for what it's worth, I've always thought Tommy was a delightful child. His departure triggered an exodus. Family members fled, murmuring excuses, avoiding eye contact with my parents. Within minutes, only the core conspirators remained. Lauren turned on my father. You said this would work. You said everyone would support us. Shut up, David snarled. Don't tell me to shut up. This was your idea, your plan. Lauren was unraveling. You said you'd done this before successfully. Lauren, my mother warned, but it was too late. Oh, she knows all about it. Lauren continued, hysteria rising. Nancy knew everything, about Robert, about Sarah, about the Tillman property. This family has been stealing from its own for decades. I held up my still recording phone. Thank you for that confession, Lauren. The DA will appreciate it. She lunged for me again, but this time Robert caught her wrist. I wouldn't. Assault charges on top of fraud won't help your case. Lauren jerked away and fled the room. We heard her car peel out moments later. My parents sat in their formal chairs, looking suddenly old and small. The authority they'd wielded so effectively had evaporated. It didn't have to be this way, my mother whispered. No, it didn't, I agreed. You could have chosen to be grandparents who loved Tommy unconditionally. Instead, you chose money, just like you chose money over Robert 20 years ago. Get out, my father said quietly. We left them sitting there in their perfectly arranged living room where they'd destroyed so many lives. As we walked out, Robert stopped at the family photo wall. He studied a picture from before his exile, all of us together smiling before greed poisoned everything. You know what the saddest part is, he said. I actually loved them once, trusted them, just like Tommy trusted them. Outside, Margaret hugged us both. You did it. You exposed them. It's not over, I warned. They'll regroup, find another angle. Let them try, Robert said. Now they know we're watching. Now everyone knows what they are. He handed me a business card. My lawyer. He's expecting your call. We're going to bury them legally. As I drove away from my childhood home for what I knew would be the last time I thought about the meeting they'd planned versus what had actually happened. They'd expected to intimidate me into compliance. Instead, they'd confess their crimes in front of witnesses while being recorded. My phone buzzed with texts from family members who'd fled the meeting. I had no idea. I'm so sorry. Is Tommy okay? I can't believe David did this before. If you need character witnesses for Tommy, I'm available. The tide had turned. The family that had been poisoned against us was seeing the truth. Lauren's confession had shattered their carefully constructed narrative. But the best text came from Principal Martinez. Just wanted you to know Tommy got 100% on his spelling test and helped a kindergartner who was lost find their classroom. Thought you could use some good news. I smiled through my tears. While his family plotted against him, Tommy continued being exactly who he was. A kind, smart, perfectly normal 7-year-old boy who deserved better than the family he'd been born into. But he had me. And now he had Robert and Margaret and a principal who'd protect him and teachers who'd fight for him. He'd lost grandparents and an aunt to greed. He'd gained an army of protectors who knew his worth had nothing to do with money. The call from Richard Coleman came 3 days after the disastrous family meeting. I almost didn't answer. Why would my family's estate lawyer be calling me directly? But curiosity won. Ms. Hartley, this is Richard Coleman. I believe you know who I am. You're the lawyer helping my family steal from my son, I said bluntly. There was a long pause. I'm calling because I believe there have been some serious misrepresentations made to my firm. Could we meet today if possible? Something in his tone made me agree. 2 hours later, I sat across from him in his downtown office, all mahogany and leather that screamed expensive legal advice. Coleman was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 40s with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He slid a file across his desk. I want you to know I'm recording this conversation for my own protection, he began. I assume you'll do the same. I placed my phone on the desk recording app visible. Go ahead. Your family, specifically your father and sister, retained me 4 months ago regarding your grandmother's trust. They presented a compelling case of a child with severe behavioral issues and a mother in denial. He opened the file. They provided what appeared to be extensive documentation. Fabricated documentation. I'm beginning to realize that. He pulled out papers I recognized. Lauren's twisted observation notes. However, they made critical errors. They claimed these incidents were witnessed by multiple family members. When I tried to verify with those witnesses last week, their stories didn't match. Because they were lying. More than that, your cousin Beth called me after the family meeting. She played me recordings. His jaw tightened. I don't appreciate being used as a tool for fraud. Then why did you take the case? Because they were convincing. Your father has a silver tongue and your sister... He shook his head. She presented herself as a concerned aunt, terrified for a child's welfare. They painted you as unstable, possibly dangerous. They said Tommy was at risk. And you believed them without investigating. I required evidence. They provided it. Photos, videos, even what appeared to be teacher concerns. He pulled out more papers. It wasn't until I received this that I realized the depth of their deception. He handed me a letter from Dr. Patricia Edmonds, the psychologist Lauren had been consulting. Said, Dear Mr. Coleman, I read aloud, I am writing to formally withdraw any involvement in the Hartley matter. Upon reflection and review, I believe I have been misled about the nature of Thomas Hartley's situation. The family members who consulted me appear to have ulterior motives that I cannot ethically support. Shh, She contacted me yesterday, Coleman explained. Apparently, your mother visited her last month seeking an evaluation without parental consent. When Dr. Edmonds explained the legal requirements, your mother asked about alternative approaches. The doctor became suspicious and did her own investigation. What did she find? That Tommy is a straight A student with no behavioral issues on record, that the concerning incidents were either normal childhood behavior or completely fabricated. He leaned forward. Ms. Hartley, I've been practicing law for 15 years. I've never seen such an elaborate attempt to pathologize a healthy child. So you're dropping them as clients. I did that yesterday, but that's not why I called you here. He pulled out another document. This is a draft petition your father had me prepare. He wasn't just going after the trust. Look at page 4. I flipped to it and felt my blood run cold. They were seeking conservatorship over Tommy's future finances, all of them. Not just the trust. Any inheritance, any gift, any asset he might acquire before age 25. Your father wanted complete financial control. Coleman's expression was grim. And on page 7, a temporary custody transfer for medical evaluation and treatment. I read, my voice hollow. They were going to try to take him from me. For his own good, they claimed. Your sister had identified a therapeutic boarding school in Montana that specializes in difficult children. Very expensive, very isolated. My hands shook. They were going to send my 7-year-old away. The plan was to gain temporary custody, send him for evaluation, use the separation to build evidence of improvement without you then argue for permanent custody changes. Coleman closed the file. I'm ashamed I drafted any of this even preliminarily. Why are you telling me this? Because I have a 7-year-old daughter, he said simply, and because I don't like being played for a fool. Your family lied to me, used me, and tried to make me complicit in what amounts to kidnapping and theft. He stood and went to his window looking out at the city. There's more. Your father asked me about precedents for challenging trusts based on diminished capacity in minors. He wanted to know if there had ever been a successful case of a child being deemed unfit to inherit before age 10. Has there? No, because it's absurd. Children can't manage money anyway. That's what trustees are for. But your father was desperate to find a loophole. Coleman turned back. He also asked about the statute of limitations on fraud. Why would he ask that? I suspect because this isn't his first attempt at something like this. He wanted to know how long someone would have to challenge previous trust disbursements. Robert's story flashed through my mind. Did you tell him? 7 years in Wisconsin for fraud. 20 years ago would be outside that window. Coleman sat back down. But there's no statute of limitations on spreading the truth. What do you want from me, Mr. Coleman? Nothing. I'm giving you information because it's the right thing to do. And a warning, your father is now seeking other counsel. He called me yesterday, furious about my withdrawal, and said he'd find someone else to finish the job. Who? I don't know, but Sherry, may I call you Sherry? There are lawyers who will take any case for the right price. Your father has money and desperation. That's a dangerous combination. More dangerous than forged school documents and falsified medical concerns. Yes, because now he's cornered. The family meeting disaster, Lauren's confession, my withdrawal. He's losing control of the narrative. Coleman pulled out his business card. This has my direct line. If they file anything anywhere, I'll likely hear about it through professional channels. I'll warn you if I can. Why would you do that? Because I helped them prepare for 4 months thinking I was protecting a child. Instead, I was helping them harm one. He stood extending his hand. I can't undo that, but I can try to make it right. I shook his hand, then paused. The boarding school in Montana, what was it called? Wilderness Reformation Academy, very remote, very strict. They specialize in breaking down and rebuilding difficult children. His expression was disgusted. I looked them up after I realized the truth. Multiple lawsuits abuse allegations. Your sister had brochures. I left Coleman's office with my head spinning. They hadn't just wanted Tommy's money, they'd wanted Tommy himself. To send him away, to fix him, to break him down until he was too damaged to inherit anything. In my car, I called Mark immediately. We need to file for emergency protective orders. They were planning to take Tommy. Based on what? I explained Coleman's revelations. Mark cursed creatively. Montana has different custody laws. If they'd gotten him there, it would have been hell getting him back. He paused. Coleman really gave you all this? He seems genuinely appalled by what he almost helped them do. Get everything in writing. His withdrawal from their case, his statement about their lies, especially the boarding school plan. Mark's voice hardened. We're filing tomorrow, restraining orders against all three of them. That night, I sat on Tommy's bed watching him sleep. He'd had a good day, scored a goal in soccer, finished his science project about butterflies, helped me make dinner. Normal, happy, perfect, exactly as he was. I thought about him in some Montana wilderness facility being told he was broken, being rebuilt into something else, being separated from everyone who actually loved him, surrounded by strangers who saw him as a paycheck. My phone buzzed. Unknown number, but I answered anyway. Sherry, a woman's voice nervous. This is Melinda Sharp. I was supposed to work with your family on a custody matter. The Guardian ad litem from Morrison's photos. I remember, I said carefully. I wanted you to know I declined the case after meeting with them today. What they're proposing? She took a breath. I've been doing this for 20 years. I've never seen such a blatant attempt to weaponize the system against a child. I thought you should know they're not giving up. Did they mention their next steps? Your father said something about finding a more cooperative team. He was very angry when I refused to participate. She paused. I've made some calls to colleagues warning them, but there's always someone willing to take questionable cases for enough money. Thank you for the warning. Ms. Hartley, I pulled your son's school records as part of my preliminary review. He's an exceptional child. Don't let them convince you otherwise. After she hung up, I made a decision. I went to my computer and began writing. An open letter to the extended Hartley family. I detailed everything. The trust, the conspiracy, the forged documents, the boarding school plan. I named names, included dates, attached evidence. Then I sent it to every family member whose email I had. If they wanted a war, they'd get transparency. By morning, my phone was flooded with responses. Shock, outrage, apologies. Family members who'd believed their lies were seeing the truth. Uncle Carl offered to testify about David's pattern of behavior. Cousin Jennifer, a social worker, offered to do a professional assessment of Tommy for court. But the most important message came from Coleman, forwarded from his office email. David Hartley has retained Brennan and Associates. They're known for aggressive tactics and questionable ethics. Be prepared. R. Coleman. I looked at Tommy eating his breakfast, chattering about the butterfly life cycle, completely unaware of the storm raging around him. Hey, buddy, I said, ruffling his hair. How about we visit Aunt Sarah for a few days? Like a vacation. Exactly like a vacation. I wasn't running. I was being strategic. If they were escalating, Tommy needed to be somewhere safe while I fought back. The war for his future had entered a new phase, but now I had allies' evidence and warnings from inside their own camp. They'd lost the element of surprise. The ambush had become a siege, and I was ready to defend what was mine. The forensic accountant's name was Diana Chen, and she came highly recommended by Robert's legal team. We met at a discreet office downtown away from prying eyes. She was all business in her sharp suit fingers, flying across her laptop as I explained the situation. Shai, financial motive in family trust disputes is common, she said, pulling up search parameters. But if your sister is as desperate as you suggest, there will be a clear trail. She lives like she has money. I offered. Big house, new cars, designer everything. Diana's smile was knowing. In my experience, those who live the largest often owe the most. Give me 48 hours. She called 2 days later. Can you meet? You need to see this in person. The evidence she'd compiled was staggering. Spreadsheets covered her desk, each one painting a darker picture than the last. Lauren is drowning. Diana began without preamble. 3 credit cards, maxed out, totaling $97,000. Personal loans from 4 different companies, totaling $130,000. Second mortgage on the house for $200,000. That's over $400,000 in debt. I calculated, feeling sick. That's just the beginning. Diana pulled up another screen. Her husband's business filed for bankruptcy 14 months ago. They've been living on credit ever since. But here's where it gets interesting. She showed me a timeline. Lauren's debt accumulation accelerated dramatically 8 months ago, right around when she started documenting Tommy's supposed issues. She knew she was running out of time. More than that, look at these communications with creditors. Diana highlighted emails. She's been promising them a substantial family inheritance to buy more time. Some of these date back to last summer. I studied the emails. Lauren had been specific, mentioning exact amounts, probable timeline, even using the trust fund amount in negotiations. She's been planning this that long. At least. But here's the smoking gun. Diana pulled up bank records. 3 months ago, she paid a retainer to Dr. Marcus Fillmore, $5,000. The check memo says consultation services. She paid him before Tommy ever supposedly needed evaluation. She was shopping for a diagnosis before creating the evidence. Diana leaned back. There's more. She's been in contact with several therapeutic boarding schools, not just the one in Montana. She requested their admission requirements and costs. 6 months ago, before any of the family meetings about Tommy's behavior. The premeditation was breathtaking. While I'd been living our normal life, thinking Lauren was just busy, she'd been orchestrating my son's destruction. Can you trace where her money went? I asked. Diana pulled up credit card statements. Living beyond their means doesn't begin to cover it. Private schools for all 3 girls, country club memberships, vacations they couldn't afford. But the real killer. They invested heavily in her husband's business, even as it was failing, throwing good money after bad. Pride, I murmured. She couldn't admit they were struggling. Look at this purchase from last month. Diana highlighted a charge. Surveillance equipment, cameras, audio recorders, purchased right before family gatherings where Tommy would be present. My stomach turned. She was recording him in her own home. The paper trail suggests systematic planning. She researched boarding schools, hired a doctor, purchased surveillance equipment, and promised creditors money from a trust, all before any documented concerns about Tommy. This proves premeditation. Beyond doubt. But there's one more thing. Diana's expression grew serious. I found communications between Lauren and a company called Family Crisis Solutions. They specialize in emergency custody transfers. What? For $5,000, they promised to facilitate rapid custody changes in crisis situations. They provide expert witnesses emergency petitions, even transportation services. Diana showed me their website. Lauren put down a deposit last month. They were going to take him, actually take him. The boarding school in Montana has a partnership with them. Kids can be transferred within 24 hours of a custody order. Diana printed out everything. This isn't just about money anymore. This is about trafficking and family trauma. I left Diana's office with boxes of evidence and a sick feeling in my stomach, but I wasn't done. I had one more stop. Private investigator Morrison had texted me an address, a storage facility on the edge of town. He met me at Unit 47B. Lauren rented this 6 months ago. He explained cutting the lock he'd legally obtained permission to remove. Paid cash, used a fake name, but she made one mistake. Used her real phone number. The door rolled up to reveal Lauren's secret archive. Boxes labeled with dates. Files organized by topic, and in the center a desk with a computer. "Is this legal?" I asked. The facility owner gave permission when I showed him the forged document evidence. He doesn't want criminal activity in his units. Morrison pulled on gloves. "Don't touch anything. I'm photographing everything for chain of custody." The boxes contained years of family photos but edited. Pictures of Tommy had notes attached. Shows aggressive play on a photo of him playing tag. Inability to sit still on a Christmas morning photo where he was excited about presents. "She's been building this narrative retroactively," I breathed. "Look at this." Morrison had found a notebook labeled Project Timothy. "His name is Tommy," I said sharply. "Exactly. She couldn't even get his name right in her own notes." He photographed each page. "This details her entire plan. Getting your parents on board, identifying cooperative professionals' timeline for custody transfer." One page made me gasp. It was a budget. Dr. Fillmore evaluation $5,000. Legal fees $20,000. Boarding school deposit $10,000. Emergency custody service $5,000. MISC expenses $5,000. Total investment $45,000. Expected return trust fund share $130,000. Net profit $88,000. "She budgeted it," I said numbly, "like a business plan." Stealing from a 7-year-old was her exit strategy from debt. Morrison moved to the computer. "Password protected, but I'll let forensics handle that." We found more in the boxes. Printouts of articles about challenging trusts. Research on judges sympathetic to grandparent rights. A list of Tommy's teachers with notes on who might be convinced to support concerns. Then Morrison found the contracts. She signed agreements with 3 different boarding schools, all contingent on gaining custody. They're all pay-to-play facilities with histories of abuse allegations. She didn't care where he went, just that he was gone. The paper trail shows escalating desperation. Morrison indicated dates on documents. The closer her financial deadlines got, the more extreme her plans became. As we left the storage unit, official investigators arriving to properly catalog everything, I felt the weight of what we'd uncovered. This wasn't a misguided family concern that got out of hand. This was a cold, calculated attempt to destroy a child for profit. Back in my car, I called Mark. "We have everything. Financial records showing premeditation contracts with boarding schools, budgets treating Tommy like a commodity." "How bad is her debt?" $427,000 and counting. She's been promising creditors Tommy's trust fund for months." Mark whistled low. "That's motive with a capital M, combined with the forgery, the surveillance, and now this planning documentation. Can we stop them? Sherry, with this evidence, we can destroy them. Criminally and civilly." He paused. "How are you holding up?" I looked at my hands, surprised to find them steady. "I'm angry, but more than that, I'm grateful we found this before they could execute their plan." "Where's Tommy now?" "Still with Sarah. I'm heading there after one more stop." That stop was Beth's house. She'd called saying Megan had left something for me. Beth handed me an envelope at her door. "Megan dropped this off an hour ago. Said it was important you get it today." Inside was a USB drive and a note in teenage handwriting. "Aunt Sherry, Mom doesn't know I have this. It's from her cloud backup. The folder is called Insurance. I think you need to see it. I'm sorry for everything. Megan." At home, I plugged in the drive with shaking hands. The folder contained videos I hadn't seen before, but these weren't of Tommy. They were of Lauren coaching her daughter's planning sessions with my parents, even a recording of her meeting with Dr. Fillmore where she explicitly told him what diagnosis she needed. The final file was audio only, dated last week. Lauren's voice talking to someone on the phone. "I don't care what it takes. That trust fund is my only way out. If we have to say the kid is psychotic, then that's what we say. I've got $45,000 invested in this plan. It has to work." I backed up everything, sent copies to Mark, to Diana, to Morrison. The evidence was overwhelming, damning, and complete. Lauren had made one crucial error in her perfect plan. She'd assumed everyone was as corrupt as she was. She'd never imagined her own daughter would choose right over family. The investigative phase was over. Now it was time for justice. Sunday dinner at my parents' house had been a family tradition for 30 years. This Sunday would be the last one. I arrived at 6 precisely as requested in my mother's text, but I didn't come alone. Mark Reynolds, my lawyer, walked beside me in his best suit. Behind us, Officer Patricia Daniels from the district attorney's office kept her hand near her radio. Through the window, I could see them all gathered. My parents, Lauren, even Lauren's husband, Ted, looking uncomfortable at the formal dining table. They were expecting another ambush, another attempt to break me down. They weren't expecting the law. I rang the doorbell and stepped back. My father answered, his practiced smile freezing when he saw my companions. Sherry, what is this?" "The end," I said simply. We entered without invitation. The dining room fell silent as Officer Daniels stepped forward, badge visible. Lauren Michelle Hartley Blake. Her voice was official firm. Lauren went pale. "Yes, I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of forgery, fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and filing false documents." The room erupted. Ted jumped up, knocking over his water glass. My mother gasped. My father started toward us, but Mark stepped forward. "Mr. Hartley, I'd advise you to sit down. We have additional warrants." "This is our home." David's face was purple with rage. "You can't just—" "Actually, we can." Officer Daniels never broke her professional calm. "Mrs. Hartley Blake, please stand up and put your hands behind your back." "No." Lauren looked wildly between her parents and me. "This is insane. I was trying to help Tommy." By forging school documents, by paying Dr. Fillmore $5,000 before any evaluation, I pulled out my phone. By budgeting how much profit you'd make from stealing his trust fund. Lauren's face went from pale to gray. "How did you—" "Your storage unit, your financial records, your own daughter." I let that sink in. "Megan gave us everything, including the recording of you saying you'd claim Tommy was psychotic if necessary." "Megan wouldn't," Lauren whispered. "She did, because unlike you, she has a conscience." Officer Daniels moved forward with handcuffs. "Ma'am, I need you to comply." Mom, Dad, do something," Lauren pleaded. David stood again. "This is harassment. We'll sue. We'll—" "Mr. Hartley," Mark interrupted, pulling out more papers. "You've been served with a civil suit for conspiracy to defraud, a minor intentional infliction of emotional distress and defamation. Mrs. Nancy Hartley, you as well." He placed papers in front of each of them with practiced efficiency. "Boo, furthermore," Mark continued, "we've filed for immediate restraining orders. None of you are to come within 500 feet of Tommy or Sherry, including at his school activities or residence." "You can't keep us from our grandson," Nancy cried. "You kept yourselves from him," I said, "the moment you decided his inheritance was worth more than his well-being." Lauren was crying now as Officer Daniels cuffed her. "Ted, call someone. Call Coleman." "Coleman withdrew from your case," I informed them. "He's actually providing evidence for the prosecution. Turns out he doesn't like being lied to and used for fraud." Ted finally spoke. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know any of this." I looked at him with something approaching pity. "Your wife spent $45,000 you didn't have on a plan to steal from a 7-year-old. How did you not know?" He sank into his chair, head in his hands. "This is all being recorded," Mark announced, indicating his phone, "for the protection of all parties. Mr. and Mrs. Hartley, I'd advise you to contact your own legal representation immediately." "Get out of our house," David said, but the authority was gone from his voice. "Gladly, but first—" I stepped forward, looking at the people who raised me, who I'd trusted, who were supposed to love my son unconditionally. "I want you to know that Tommy is thriving. His teachers adore him. His coaches praise him. His friends' parents request him for playdates. The only people who saw problems were the ones who stood to profit from them. We were concerned, Nancy protested weakly. No, you were greedy. I pulled out a final document. This is from Robert Morrison. Remember him. Your nephew you destroyed 20 years ago. He's financing a civil suit against you for what you did to him. Turns out there's no statute of limitations on spreading the truth. David's face went ashen. Robert wouldn't. He would. He is. He's also provided evidence to the Bar Association about Coleman's predecessor, Dr. Stern, the doctor you paid to falsely diagnose Robert. I smiled coldly. Your past is catching up with you. Officer Daniels guided Lauren toward the door. We need to go to the station now. Aye, Sherry, please, Lauren begged. I'm your sister. Think of my girls. I am thinking of them. I'm thinking of how you corrupted them, turned them into spies against their cousin. I'm thinking of how Megan felt so guilty she risked your wrath to give us evidence. I'm thinking of how they deserve better than a mother who would destroy a child for money. This will ruin me. You ruined yourself the moment you decided my son was a price tag. As Officer Daniels led Lauren out, Ted following numbly, I turned back to my parents one last time. The trust is secured. Tommy's inheritance is protected with additional safeguards. You will never touch a penny of it. I picked up the family photo from the mantel, all of us together last Christmas before they banned my son. He asked about you yesterday, asked if he'd been bad, if that's why you don't love him anymore. My mother sobbed. My father stared at the table. I told him the truth, that some people let money become more important than family, that it wasn't his fault, that he's perfect exactly as he is. I set the photo face down. He's 7 years old and he's already learned that love shouldn't come with conditions. Sherry, my father started. No, I cut him off. You don't get to speak. You don't get to justify. You don't get to manipulate. You get to live with what you've done. Mark touched my elbow. We should go. The criminal proceedings will move quickly now. As we walked out, I heard my mother call after me. Will we ever see him again? I paused at the door, but didn't turn around. That's up to the courts now, and Tommy. When he's older, if he wants to know the grandparents who tried to steal his future, that'll be his choice. But I'll make sure he knows the truth first. The door closed on 30 years of family dinners, holiday gatherings, and false love. Outside, Officer Daniels was putting Lauren in the patrol car. She'd stopped crying, her face set in bitter lines. Our eyes met through the window, and I saw no remorse, only anger at being caught. You okay? Mark asked as we watched the patrol car drive away. I will be. I looked up at the house where I'd grown up, where I'd brought Tommy as a baby, where we'd celebrated so many milestones. They made their choice. Now they get to live with the consequences. The DA thinks the criminal case is solid, with the forged documents, the financial evidence, and the recordings. What about custody? Can they still try? They can try anything, but with criminal charges, restraining orders, and the evidence of their conspiracy, Mark smiled. No judge in the state would give them the time of day. My phone buzzed. Sarah sending a video of Tommy playing soccer in her backyard, laughing as he scored a goal between two garden gnomes. That's what matters, I said, showing Mark. He's safe. He's happy. He's free from their poison. And rich, Mark added with a grin. That trust fund will be worth over $500,000 by the time he's 18. He was already rich, I corrected. He has people who actually love him. The money's just a bonus. As we drove away, I didn't look back. That part of my life was over. The family that had chosen greed over a child was gone. But the family that mattered, Tommy and me, Sarah and her kids Robert and Margaret, even young Megan who chose courage over compliance, that family was stronger than ever. The counterattack was complete. Now it was time to build something better from the ruins. The video started circulating on Tuesday morning. By lunch, it had been shared over 1,000 times on local community Facebook pages. By evening, our local news station had picked it up. Community rallies behind boy targeted by family's greed, the headline read. It began with Mrs. Peterson, Tommy's teacher, looking directly into the camera in her classroom. "I've been teaching for 25 years," she said firmly. "Tommy Hartley is one of the kindest, brightest, most well-adjusted students I've ever had the privilege to teach." Then came Coach Martinez from soccer, standing on the field where Tommy played. "This kid helps other players up when they fall. He shares his snacks. He cheers for both teams. If that's a behavioral problem, I wish all kids had it." Dr. Rachel Summers, Tommy's pediatrician in her office with degrees visible behind her. "I've examined Tommy every year since birth. He's a healthy, normal, thriving child. Any suggestion otherwise is categorically false." One after another, they came forward. The librarian who talked about Tommy's love of dinosaur books and how he read to younger kids. The art teacher who displayed his projects showing creativity and focus. The lunch lady who described how he always said please and thank you. But it was the kids segment that went viral. "Tommy's my best friend," said Jake, his classmate sitting on the playground. "He taught me to tie my shoes when everyone else made fun of me for not knowing." "He gave me his lunch when I forgot mine," added Emma, "and he didn't even tell anyone." "Tommy includes everyone in games," said Anthony, "even the kids nobody else plays with." The video had been Sarah's idea, organized by a group of parents who were outraged when the truth came out. What started as a character reference for potential court proceedings became a community statement against greed and child exploitation. But the video's true power came from its ending. 17 children from Tommy's class stood together on the school steps holding handmade signs. "Tommy is our friend. Nice kids aren't broken. Families should protect kids. Money, love." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Comments flooded in. "What kind of family does this to a child? Those grandparents should be ashamed. Thank God he has a mother who fought for him. This is what greed does to families." Lauren's real estate business imploded within 48 hours. Her professional headshot disappeared from the company website. Clients canceled contracts. The local realtor association announced they were reviewing her membership. Then came the unexpected allies. Wednesday afternoon, my doorbell rang. Tommy was upstairs playing Finally Home after the restraining orders were in place. I opened the door to find Aunt Patricia, my father's sister, who'd been questioned about Tommy's toddler years. Behind her stood 5 other extended family members. "We came to apologize," Patricia said simply, "and to offer our support." They filed into my living room, some I hadn't seen in months. Uncle Carl, cousin Jennifer, great-aunt Dorothy, who'd fled the ambush meeting, and others who'd been poisoned against us by lies. "We were manipulated," Carl said gruffly. "David and Lauren, they made us believe." "Well, it doesn't matter what they made us believe. We should have known better." "The video opened our eyes," Patricia added. "Seeing all those people defend Tommy, seeing those children support him, we realized we'd been fed lies." Jennifer, the social worker, pulled out a document. "I did my own evaluation of the situation, unofficial but thorough. If you need it for court, I'll testify that this entire situation constitutes emotional abuse of a minor by family members." "We've also been talking," Dorothy said, her elderly voice strong, "about David's patterns, what he did to Robert. Other instances we overlooked or excused. We're prepared to provide statements about his history of this behavior." I felt tears prick my eyes. I don't know what to say. "Say, you'll let us try to make amends," Patricia said. "Not David and Nancy and Lauren, they made their choices, but the rest of us who let ourselves be fooled. Tommy deserves to know he has family who care about him." "It would have to be slow," I said carefully, "and supervised at first. He's been hurt." "Whatever you think is best," Carl agreed. "We just want him to know not everyone in this family is corrupt." As they left, Patricia lingered. "I've been in touch with Robert," she said quietly. "He's considering coming back for a visit. Maybe it's time to heal more than just Tommy's wounds." That evening, the news ran a follow-up story. They'd tried to contact my parents and Lauren for comment. The footage showed my parents' house with curtains drawn cars in the driveway, but no one answering the door. Lauren's mugshot appeared on screen with details about the charges against her. But it was the interview with Principal Martinez that made the biggest impact. What happened to Tommy Hartley represents a failure of family but a success of community, she said to the reporter. When the people who should protect a child fail, it's up to all of us to step in. Tommy's teachers, coaches, friends, and their parents. We all saw a bright, kind child being targeted, and we said no, not on our watch. The reporter asked, "What would you say to families watching who might be dealing with similar situations?" Document everything, trust your instincts, and remember, a child's worth is not measured in dollars, but in the love they give and receive. Tommy Hartley is wealthy in all the ways that matter. My phone hadn't stopped buzzing all day. Texts, calls, messages of support, some from strangers who'd seen the story, many from people I knew who'd had no idea what we were going through. But the message that mattered most came from Tommy himself, who'd been quietly building with blocks while I dealt with the chaos. "Mom," he said, looking up at me with those trusting eyes. "Jake's mom said people made a video about me being a good kid." "That's right, baby, because you are a good kid." "So Grandma and Grandpa were wrong. I'm not bad." I knelt beside him, pulling him into a hug. "You were never bad. Not for 1 second. Grandma and Grandpa made a mistake. A big one." "Maybe they need a timeout," he said seriously. "Maybe they do," I agreed. "A very long timeout." "Can I watch the video? Are you sure you want to?" He nodded. "I want to see my friends." So we watched it together, Tommy on my lap, his face lighting up as each person defended him. When the children appeared with their signs, he clapped. "They're all my friends," he said proudly. "Even Anthony, and he doesn't usually like anybody." "You know what this means?" I asked him. "What?" "It means you're loved. Really, truly loved by so many people." "I love them too," he said simply. "That's what matters, right, love? That's the only thing that matters, baby." Later, after Tommy was in bed, I sat alone watching the community response continue to grow. The video had expanded beyond our local area. Comments came from around the state, then beyond. Parents sharing their own stories of family betrayal over inheritance, educators praising the school's response, legal experts weighing in on the criminal charges. But it was a comment from a username I recognized that stopped me cold. "Morrison CA, this happened to me 20 years ago in the same family. I lost everything but rebuilt my life. Seeing this community stand up for Tommy gives me hope. No child should go through what we went through. Thank you to everyone who spoke up. Robert Morrison, formerly Hartley." Below it, hundreds of responses expressed shock that this was a pattern support for Robert and increased anger at my parents. My phone rang. Mark. "You've seen the response." "It's overwhelming," I admitted. "In the best way," the DA called. "With this level of public attention and support, they're expediting Lauren's case. They want to make an example of this kind of fraud against children." "What about my parents?" "Their lawyer contacted me. They want to negotiate." "No." "Hear me out. They're willing to sign away any claim to Tommy, any future contact, any involvement in the trust in exchange for lessened civil penalties." "They have no claim anyway." "No, but this would make it ironclad, forever. No appeals, no changes of heart, no deathbed reconciliations unless Tommy initiates it as an adult." "I considered this. What's your recommendation?" "Take it. Lock them out legally and permanently. Let them live with their choices while you and Tommy live your lives." "Draw it up, but I want one addition. They have to allocate funds for therapy, for Tommy, for Lauren's girls, for any family member affected by their schemes." "I like it. Restorative justice." After we hung up, I looked at the family photo I'd taken from their house. All of us together, smiling before greed poisoned everything. I'd kept it to remember that there had been good times even if they were built on lies. But now I had new photos to focus on. Tommy with his teachers, Tommy with his real supporters, Tommy being celebrated by his community for exactly who he was. I fed the old photo to my shredder, watching our false family disappear strip by strip. The reckoning was complete. The community had spoken. The family that mattered had stepped up. And Tommy was exactly where he should be, asleep in his bed, dreaming of dinosaurs and soccer, protected by people who loved him for himself, not for his trust fund. The video had shown the world what I'd always known: my son was extraordinary in his ordinariness, special in his normalcy, perfect in his imperfection. No amount of money could buy what Tommy had earned simply by being himself. The fierce love and protection of a community that refused to let greed win. The call came at 10 p.m. on a Thursday, 3 weeks after Lauren's arrest. An unknown number, but something made me answer. "Please don't hang up." My mother's voice, but different. Broken. "I need to tell you something about your father, about everything." "Mom," the lawyers said. "I know what they said. I don't care anymore." I heard ice clinking in a glass. "David's gone, left this morning, but before he left I found things. Things you need to know." Despite everything, concern crept in. "Are you okay?" A bitter laugh. "I haven't been okay in years. Can I come over? I'll understand if you say no, but this can't wait." I thought of Tommy safe in bed, of the restraining orders, of all the pain she'd caused. "You can come to the porch. We'll talk outside." 20 minutes later, Nancy Hartley sat on my porch steps, looking like she'd aged a decade in 3 weeks. No makeup, hair unwashed, wearing a housecoat I remembered from my childhood. She clutched a box in her lap. "He's been gambling," she started without preamble, "for years. I found the records he hid, the second mortgages I didn't know about, the loans from people you don't want to owe money to. I stayed by my door ready to go inside if needed. How much?" 200,000, maybe more." She opened the box papers, spilling out. "But that's not the worst part. These people, they've been threatening him, threatening us." She handed me a letter, her hand shaking. I read it by porch light. Promises of violence if payment wasn't made, mentions of family members by name. The date was 6 months ago. "He came to me in tears," Nancy continued, "said he'd found a way to fix everything. The trust fund, Tommy's trust fund. He said it wasn't fair anyway, one child getting everything." "So you went along with it?" I was terrified. The words exploded out of her. "These people knew where we lived, where you lived, where Tommy went to school. David said if we could just access the trust, he could pay them off and we'd all be safe." "You could have come to me, could have called the police." "With what proof David hid everything? I only found this because he left in such a hurry." She pulled out more papers. "Loan documents I never signed but have my signature. Debts in my name I didn't know existed. He's been forging my signature for years." The irony wasn't lost on me, like Lauren forged mine. "He taught her well." Nancy's laugh was a hollow. "All those family members he destroyed over the years, I thought they really had problems. Robert, with drinking, Sarah, with her breakdown, the others. I believed him every time." "You helped him." "I know. God, I know." She buried her face in her hands. "I was young when we married, and he was so confident, so sure. By the time I started questioning things, I was in too deep. He'd isolated me from my own family, made me dependent on him." "Where is he now?" "I don't know. He packed one suitcase and left. Said he had to handle things before they handled him." She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "Sherry, I think he's running, and I think these people will come looking for their money." I pulled out my phone. "We need to call the police. Now." "I have more." She upended the box documents, scattering. Every scheme he ever pulled, every family member he targeted. Names, dates, amounts. He kept records like trophies. While I called 911, I scanned the papers. 25 years of manipulation. Cousins, uncles, business partners, anyone who had something David wanted, and beside each name amounts what he'd gained from destroying them. The total was staggering, over $3 million across 2 decades. Officer Daniels arrived within minutes, followed by a detective I didn't recognize. They took Nancy's statement, collected the documents, and made calls about the threats. "We'll put a patrol on both houses," the detective assured us. "These loan sharks are serious, but they usually back off when law enforcement gets involved." "What about David?" I asked. "We'll issue a warrant. Abandonment fraud forgery. He's looking at serious time if we find him." As they prepared to leave, Nancy spoke up. "There's one more thing." She pulled out a final document. Tommy's trust. David had papers drawn up to change the beneficiary to himself if something happened to you and Tommy. My blood ran cold. "What?" "He never filed them, but they're dated last month. Sherry, I don't think taking Tommy was the end game. I think—" She couldn't finish. The detective took the papers, his expression grim. "We'll add conspiracy charges. This shows potential intent to harm." After they left, Nancy and I sat in silence on the porch. The woman who'd helped torment my son looked broken, terrified, and somehow smaller than I remembered. "I know you can't forgive me," she said finally. "I don't forgive myself, but I wanted you to know the truth. All of it. Why didn't you stop him? All those years, all those people hurt." I was a coward. I told myself it wasn't my business, that David knew best. I chose comfortable lies over ugly truths. She stood slowly like an old woman. "I'm going to stay with my sister in Michigan. The police have the information. If you need me to testify, I will." "What about Lauren?" Nancy's face hardened slightly. Lauren knew exactly what she was doing. David may have taught her, but she embraced it. Her greed was her own. "And Tommy? Do you really believe he has problems?" For the first time that night, Nancy looked me directly in the eyes. "No, I never did. He's a perfect little boy. I let my fear override my love, and I'll never forgive myself for that." She walked to her car, each step heavy with regret. At the door, she turned back. "Tell Tommy. Tell him Grandma's sorry. Tell him it was never about him. It was about weak people making terrible choices." "Maybe someday," I said, "when he's older, when he can understand." "I won't hold my breath," Nancy said. "I don't deserve his forgiveness. I just wanted him to know he was never the problem. We were." After she left, I sat on my porch until midnight processing everything. David hadn't just been greedy, he'd been desperate. Desperate enough to destroy anyone, including his own grandson, to save himself from violent creditors. The gambling addiction explained so much. The escalating schemes, the increasing desperation, the willingness to cross any line. He'd turned the family into his personal ATM, withdrawing trust and love along with money. My phone buzzed. Mark texting despite the late hour. Police called. David was picked up at the Canadian border. He's in custody. I felt no relief, no satisfaction, just emptiness where my father used to be. Inside, I checked on Tommy one more time. He slept peacefully, unaware that his grandfather had contemplated even worse than theft, that the trust fund had made him a target not just for greed, but potentially for something darker. But he was safe, surrounded by people who actually loved him, protected by law and community, untouched by the poison that had infected his family tree. I kissed his forehead and whispered, "You're safe, baby, and you always will be." In the morning, I'd have to decide how much truth to share with the world. The gambling debts added a new dimension to the story. David wasn't just greedy, but desperate, not just cruel, but dangerous. But tonight, I just sat with the truth Nancy had revealed. 25 years of lies unraveling in one evening. A family patriarch exposed as a serial predator. A grandmother choosing truth too late, but choosing it nonetheless. The complete truth was worse than anyone imagined, but at least now it was in the open, documented, and delivered to authorities who could ensure David never hurt another family member again. Tommy stirred in his sleep, smiling at some dream. I wondered if he dreamed of dinosaurs or soccer, of his friends or his teachers who'd stood up for him. Whatever he dreamed, it wasn't of gambling debts and violent threats of grandfathers who saw him as collateral damage of families that valued money over children. His dreams were still clean, still innocent, still protected. And I'd make sure they stayed that way. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters on a crisp March morning, 6 months after that Christmas Eve that changed everything. I held Tommy's hand as we walked past them, his dinosaur backpack bouncing with each step. "Is that Tommy?" one reporter called out. "Tommy, how do you feel about today?" I'd prepared him for this, but Tommy surprised me by stopping and looking directly at the camera. "I feel good. My mom says today is about making sure people can't hurt kids for money." Inside the courthouse, the security was tight. David's gambling creditors had made threats after his arrest, but law enforcement had taken them seriously. We were escorted to a private room where Mark waited with our team. "Lauren pled guilty," he said without preamble. 20 minutes ago. Forgery, fraud, conspiracy. She's looking at 2 years probation and 300 hours of community service. No jail time. The judge considered her daughters, but she's a convicted felon now. She'll never work in real estate again, and she has to pay full restitution for all the costs you incurred fighting this. Through the window, I saw Lauren being led out a side door. She looked smaller somehow, her designer clothes replaced with a simple black suit. Our eyes met for a moment. I expected anger, defiance. Instead, I saw something that might have been shame. "What about my father?" "That's why we're here. His sentencing is in an hour. The prosecution wants you to make a victim impact statement." "I'm not a victim," Tommy piped up. "I'm a victor. Mrs. Peterson taught me the difference." Mark smiled. "You're absolutely right, buddy. How about we call it a victor statement instead?" While Tommy colored at the table, I prepared my words. How did you sum up the betrayal of parents who chose money over their grandson? How did you explain the ripple effects of greed that went back decades? The courtroom was packed when we entered, media community members who'd supported us, and surprisingly, a full row of extended family. Patricia, Carl, Jennifer, and others who discovered the truth and chosen justice over silence. David sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, looking like he'd aged 20 years. The gambling had caught up with him in prison. Without access to his schemes and manipulations, he was just a desperate old man who destroyed his family for debts he couldn't pay. The judge, Harold Winters, had a reputation for protecting children. He'd reviewed all the evidence, including the 25 years of family fraud Nancy had revealed. "Ms. Hartley," Judge Winters said, "would you like to address the court?" I stood my prepared remarks in hand, but set them aside. This needed to come from the heart. "Your Honor, 6 months ago, my parents and sister conspired to steal my son's inheritance by painting him as mentally disturbed. They forged documents, paid for false diagnoses, and planned to send him to an abusive facility in Montana. All for money." I looked at David, forcing him to meet my eyes. But this wasn't his first victim. For 25 years, my father has systematically destroyed family members who had something he wanted. Robert Morrison lost a business. Sarah Chen lost her inheritance. Others lost their reputations, their relationships, their trust in family. He taught my sister his methods, creating a second generation of family predators. He gambled away security and tried to make my 7-year-old son pay for his debts. He turned love into a transaction and family into a business opportunity. My voice strengthened, but he failed. He failed because a community stood up and said no. Teachers, coaches, neighbors, and yes, family members with consciences refused to let a child be sacrificed for an adult's greed. I turned to the gallery, seeing Principal Martinez, Mrs. Peterson, Coach Martinez, and dozens of others who'd supported us. Tommy isn't here as a victim. He's here as proof that good people protecting children will always defeat those who would exploit them. Your Honor, my father stole more than money over the years. He stole trust, love, and family bonds that can never be repaired. My son asks me why his grandfather doesn't love him, and I have no answer except the truth, that some people love money more than children. David Hartley deserves the maximum sentence, not just for what he did to Tommy, but for 25 years of destroying families, for teaching his daughter that children are commodities, for choosing gambling debts over his grandson's future. He's not just a thief, he's a predator who hunts within his own family. I sat down, hands shaking. Tommy reached over and patted my arm. Good job, Mom. The judge called David to stand for sentencing. Mr. Hartley, in 30 years on the bench, I've rarely seen such calculated cruelty toward a child. You didn't just attempt to steal money. You attempted to steal a 7-year-old's future, his security, his faith in family. The evidence shows a pattern spanning decades. You are what I call a family predator, someone who exploits the trust and love of relatives for financial gain. You taught your daughter these methods, creating generational trauma. For the charges of conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, elder abuse in the case of your mother's trust manipulation, and criminal threatening related to your gambling debts, I sentence you to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years probation. You are ordered to pay full restitution to all victims identified in the investigation. Furthermore, you are permanently barred from any contact with Thomas Hartley or any minor family members. You forfeit all rights to family trust funds or inheritances. And Mr. Hartley, I hope you use your time in prison to reflect on how greed cost you everything that actually mattered. The gavel came down with finality. David was led away without looking back. I felt no satisfaction, just relief. It was over. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was larger, but this time they weren't just reporters. Community members held signs, "Protect Children, Not Profit," and "Tommy's Army." Principal Martinez approached with a smile. "We have something for Tommy." She handed him an envelope. Inside was a certificate, Student Excellence Award for Kindness, Leadership, and Resilience. "We usually wait for end of year," she explained, "but the school board voted unanimously to present this early. Tommy, you've shown us all what strength looks like." Tommy beamed, holding his certificate like treasure. "Can I put this in my backpack with my dinosaurs?" "You can put it wherever you want, sweetheart." I laughed, tears threatening. As we walked to our car, Robert Morrison intercepted us. He'd been at every hearing, silent support from someone who understood. "It's done," he said simply. "The cycle is broken. David can't hurt anyone else." "Thank you for coming forward, for telling your story." He knelt to Tommy's level. "You know what, buddy, you're braver than I was. You had people who fought for you, but you also stood tall through all of this. Don't ever let anyone make you feel less than amazing." Tommy studied him seriously. "Are you my cousin Mom says you're family, but I never met you before?" "I am, and I'm sorry I wasn't around sooner, but I'm here now if that's okay." "Do you like dinosaurs?" Robert smiled. "I love dinosaurs." "Then you can be my family," Tommy decided. That evening, we held a celebration at Sarah's house. Not a party for the convictions, but a gathering of the family we'd built through this ordeal. Blood relatives who'd chosen right teachers who'd become advocates, neighbors who'd become protectors. Megan was there living with Patricia now while Lauren served her probation and got treatment. She hugged Tommy tightly, whispering apologies he didn't understand the need for. "You saved me," I told her quietly. "Your courage in giving us that evidence saved Tommy." "He's my cousin," she said simply. "You protect family, real family." As the sun set, I found myself on Sarah's porch with Margaret watching Tommy play with the other children. He was laughing carefree, untouched by the darkness we'd navigated. Nancy wrote me, Margaret said. From Michigan, she's in therapy dealing with 25 years of enabling David. She wants to know if there's any chance. Maybe someday, I said, when Tommy's older, when he can decide for himself. But not now. Now he needs to just be 7. And the trust? Secured with triple protections. Mark set up a board of trustees including Robert Principal Martinez and Judge Harrison. No single person can ever threaten it again. Margaret nodded. Rose would be proud. Her gift is safe, but more importantly, her great-grandson is loved and protected. A year ago, I'd thought family meant blood, that grandparents automatically loved grandchildren, that sisters protected each other. I'd been naive. Now I knew better. Family meant showing up. Family meant standing against wrong even when it was hard. Family meant protecting children from those who would harm them, even if those people shared DNA. "Oh, Mom," Tommy called. "Come play soccer with us." I joined the game, laughing as Tommy scored goal after goal. His certificate of excellence was pinned to Sarah's refrigerator, right next to his drawings of dinosaurs and photos with his real family. Later, as I tucked him into bed at home, Tommy asked, "Mom or Grandma and Grandpa ever coming back?" "No, baby. They made choices that means they can't be in our lives anymore. Because they tried to take my money. Because they tried to hurt you for money, and people who would hurt children can't be trusted." He considered this with 7-year-old wisdom. "That makes sense, like how we don't pet dogs that growl." "Exactly like that. I'm glad they can't hurt other kids now," he said sleepily, "and I'm glad I have my good family, the ones who love me for real." "Me too, baby, me too." As he drifted off to sleep, I reflected on our journey, from that shocking Christmas Eve rejection to a courtroom victory, from family betrayal to community embrace, from isolation to an army of protectors. Tommy's inheritance was secure, but more importantly, his childhood was preserved. He'd learned hard lessons about trust and family, but he'd also learned about strength, justice, and the power of good people standing together. The trust fund would be there when he turned 18, now worth even more thanks to careful management. But his real inheritance was richer, the knowledge that he was valued for himself, protected by many, and loved unconditionally by those who mattered. David was in prison. Lauren was facing her consequences. Nancy was confronting decades of complicity. The cycle of family predation had ended. And Tommy was exactly where he should be, safe, loved, and free to be a perfectly normal 7-year-old boy with a bright future unshadowed by greed. Justice had been served, redemption was possible for some, and love, real love, not the conditional kind offered by those who saw dollar signs instead of a child, had won. The war was over. We'd won. But more importantly, Tommy had survived with his innocence and trust intact, surrounded by people who would ensure he never faced such betrayal again. That was the greatest victory of all. If you've experienced family betrayal over inheritance or financial matters, you're not alone. Have you ever had to protect a child from toxic family members who put money above love? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking and subscribing to hear more stories about families who choose love over greed, communities that protect their vulnerable, and children who triumph over those who would exploit them. Share this story with others who might need to hear that standing up to family predators is not only possible but necessary. Thank you for reading Tommy's story. May all children find themselves surrounded by those who see their true worth, not in dollars, but in the immeasurable value of their spirits. Remember, family isn't defined by blood, but by those who stand up and protect when protection is needed most.